Chapter 481.
How much time went by?
For well over an hour, a fierce battle took place in the path leading to the imperial capital, Gloria Eterna.
One dragon was facing off an army of 1,000, a scene truly reminiscent of a legend passed down through the ages.
Of course, if Twisted Kindness could triumph, this moment would become a true legend. Unfortunately, she fell short of achieving it. Kook! Twisted Kindness spat out blood.
Her legs staggered, the back of her head ached, and her brain stung.
She had been hit on the back of her head without noticing.
However, she had no time to look back and check or even stand straight.
It was because a flurry of attacks poured down the moment she paused briefly. Even while swaying, Twisted Kindness swung her swords not to be buried by the consecutive attacks.
There were 4 enemies that Twisted Kindness felt threatened from.
The problem was the small attacks that came between each of them. For example, there was a group of 4 high rankers, servants, and the spirits acting under the Spirit King's command without regard for their lives. Twisted Kindness was already running low on resources, and these minuscule attacks were no longer negligible. The attacks of the 4 threats came smoothly from between these small attacks. When the phoenix shot its sacred flames directly, Un-Yuri's origin magic would aim for her back. Then Baek Haiju and the 7 Sins Apostles would attack from the sides.
Not even the great Twisted Kindness could do anything in this situation. Being pushed back repeatedly, she gave up on counter-attacking and became busy trying to block the attacks.
Even then, her mind reeled from the continued onslaught.
After a certain point, she had to swing her twin swords with clusters of spirits and vengeful spirits clinging on like vines.
Pook! She allowed yet another attack to go through. A freezing sensation instantly spread across her back. She lost track of how many times she let it happen.
The next thing she noticed was a blazing longsword striking down at her forehead as if to crack it in half.
Bastard! Twisted Kindness swung her left arm in a fit of anger. PK! The sword in her hand cleanly severed Phi Sora's arm.
But because it was right after she suffered a blow, her movement had been unnecessarily big. Since she could not afford to counterattack in the first place, doing so created a brief opening. However, no one thought of this moment as a golden opportunity.
If there was one thing they learned from Russell, it was that an opportunity was created by exploiting the openings and making them bigger. And so, what Phi Sora and her groupmates did was to cling onto that small opportunity.
UK?
Twisted Kindness suddenly flinched. Chohong, Hugo, and Vlad Halep.
The 3 of them clung to her left arm.
Throwing their weapons away, they only held onto her arm like leeches. You!
Twisted Kindness did her best to shake them off, but it wasn't easy.
It was because the World Tree and Philip Muller focused their restraints on her left arm. What surprised Twisted Kindness even more was that fireflies gathered around the severed surface of Phi Sora's arm and regenerated it in an instant. The Vengeful Spirit Unit and the Spirit Realm's spirits also prevented her from twisting her body, and the 4 Valhalla members refused to let go of her arm. Eventually, Twisted Kindness fiercely attacked with her right arm and forced them to fall back. This only made her shut her eyes. Her arms, legs, and even her tail had not been enough.
So to use her right arm, she had to pay the price elsewhere. Quang! As expected, the feeling of her side being torn crept up. Baek Haiju's reinforced sword chi had hit her immediately. A soundless groan escaped Twisted Kindness' mouth.
She swayed sideways, and her feet finally left the ground.
A definite opportunity was finally created. The Allied force did not miss this chance. All sorts of attacks poured out. A colorful explosion erupted from Twisted Kindness' falling body. The light that burst out dyed her body as if to devour her. Despite this, the attacks continued. Quang, 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 quang. Every time she was hit, she was pushed back, unable to fall. It was only after she was hit with the Phoenix's heavy tackle that she was sent flying back and crashed to the ground. Did we get her?
Chohong said, panting.
Hoshino Urara, who was about to throw her dagger to confirm the kill, turned to Chohong in a fright.
What? Chohong, who was wiping her chin with the back of her hand, closed her mouth. It was because she saw Twisted Kindness getting up in the distance. It was right after she hit the ground too. Of course, she wasn't in a good state. Cough, cough. Twisted Kindness spat out another mouthful of blood. Sweat that streamed down from her forehead mixed with blood and soaked her face.
Her chest and stomach area were also stained red with blood.
Most importantly, her right side was torn and ragged.
As she wiped her bloody face, she truly looked like a demon. What was important to note here was that she got up even after suffering such a bombardment of attacks. And it even felt like her energy was getting fiercer.
This is crazy. Oh, Rahi murmured with an exhausted look. Ah!
Why did you say that? Hoshino Urara fixed her grip on her dagger, yelling angrily.
She's almost dead. Kill her. Teresa also shouted while pointing her sword at Twisted Kindness. As if to respond to her shout, dozens of people rushed in at once. Me? At that moment, Twisted Kindness' vigor surged. Quang! Soldiers that foolishly charged in were all blown up. With just a single swing of her longsword, Twisted Kindness had popped their bodies like balloons.
Amidst the flying flesh and blood, Twisted Kindness' eyes glinted. You want to kill me?
Next, her body emitted a light mixed with a strange heat. Brilliantly, like a candle blazing its final light. Twisted Kindness, the strongest army commander of the parasites.
The last member of the dragon race, having survived the War of Myths only passed down as legends.
Let's see you try it. Kung! When Twisted Kindness planted her feet on the ground, the earth cracked open. It was genuinely a terrifying killing intent and pressure. Yu-wah!
Turning pale from the terrifying fear, many unwittingly rushed in with their weapons.
They did not even think about running away.
They felt like they would go crazy if they did not do at least this. At that moment, Twisted Kindness spread her arms and strutted out her chest. Quang! Divinity burst out from her body, detonating everything in her surroundings. As if that wasn't enough, it turned into dragon-shaped masses and gathered around Twisted Kindness.
Ha!
When she shouted, 12 dragons formed of light shot out in all directions.
Swept away by the storm, Flown screamed and flew backward. Chinzia's Valkyries also shattered, unable to say a word. Twisted Kindness then grabbed the threads that penetrated through the storm and chucked them far after spinning them around. Agnes spun in the air before crashing into Wu Lei, who was swinging his greatsword. The vengeful spirit unit and the group of spirits on her body also disappeared. Ifrit and Aqua moved to stop her advance but were shredded apart as well. Every time Twisted Kindness took a step forward, the earth split, and a storm of light raged in all directions. Anything that entered her range blew up without exception. Even as this happened, Baek Haiju hid her presence and continued to look for an opportunity to strike. Twisted Kindness had suddenly regained her energy. Baek Haiju did not think this state would last long. Their previous attack had definitely been effective. Feeling that her life was at risk, Twisted Kindness must have scraped up every bit of her remaining divinity. She had lost her cool for the first time in this battle. A little more, just a little more. At that moment, she saw the dragons of light spinning around Twisted Kindness becoming fainter. Freeze World. Un Yuri's final solo arrived at a timely moment. Wish! A bitter cold raged in. Trapped in a snowstorm, the dragons froze up and slowed down. Twisted Kindness also came to a halt while walking forward steadily. Baek Haiju's eyes lit up. Now! Kicking off the ground, she shot forward like a bullet. She aimed for the opening that was created when Twisted Kindness came to a sudden halt. However, she realized she was wrong the next moment. She was right for the most part, but she got the premise wrong.
It was true that Twisted Kindness was scraping up every bit of energy left in her, but it was wrong that she lost her cool from rage.
In fact, she was exceedingly level-headed at the moment. Twisted Kindness turned to the side slightly so that her heart would move to the back.
At the same time, she grabbed the twin swords in reverse and cut diagonally.
Twisted Kindness' cold eyes flashed. Ah!
Baek Haiju did a double take, realizing that the enemy's simple movement had messed up her calculations.
If she at least attacked as she originally planned to, she would have been able to achieve a mutual death.
However, when their eyes met, Baek Haiju hesitated. It was too late to retract the spear she stretched out, and it was also too late to dodge. As Twisted Kindness' sword neared the tip of Baek Haiju's nose, Baek Haiju became dazed.
Her mind went blank, and her vision also turned white. Clang! Suddenly, an ear-splitting sound rang out. Crock! Something cracked and shattered in front of her as well.
Baek Haiju had no time to figure out what it was. By the time she regained her senses, she only saw her spear shooting straight toward the enemy.
Pook! A stumpy sensation was transmitted to her hands.
Baek Haiju's eyes lit up.
Twisted Kindness was still looking at her with her body half-turned. For a moment, Baek Haiju froze up from the chilling gaze. Twisted Kindness trembled. Clang! The sound of glass shattering broke out. Next, the arm that aimed for Baek Haiju slowly fell. And Twisted Kindness.
Did not move. Baek Haiju slowly turned her head and saw the remnants of a broken barrier falling down. Did the barrier somehow succeed in blocking Twisted Kindness' attack? Baek Haiju's blinking eyes caught sight of one person. Seo Yuhui. She was breathing heavily with her hands stretched out toward Baek Haiju, holding the proof of castitas in her hands. A chill ran down Baek Haiju's back as she subconsciously rubbed her forehead. To think Twisted Kindness would use such a perilous situation as a trap. A heavy silence flowed in the area. Baek Haiju realized that she was still holding onto her spear. The Tathagata spear had penetrated the enemy's heart.
Normally, this would not have been enough as a killing blow. It must only have succeeded because of all the damage that was amassed until now. Twisted Kindness no longer moved, but she did not fall either. She was standing in the same position she was a moment ago. Her eyes were still open. Gulp. Baek Haiju's throat drew a small gulp. She felt like Twisted Kindness would come flying at her any second. Thankfully, that did not happen. In reality, Twisted Kindness had been pushing herself ever since the World Tree finished migrating, and Philip Muller returned to restrain her divinity. Soon, Baek Haiju could see a bright light erupt in front of her. Twisted Kindness was perishing.
When the light subsided, Twisted Kindness was nowhere to be seen. Only a faintly shining orb remained in her place.
Ha! It was only then that everyone let out the breath they'd been holding in. Some of them even collapsed on the ground. Looking around, Chinzia gave a bitter smile. The two remaining Spirit Kings were gone. No one realized when they had been killed. The vengeful spirit unit and the army of spirits that illuminated the sky had almost diminished significantly. That wasn't all. Humans had also suffered significant losses.
Corpses of the Six Kingdoms soldiers and earthlings lay everywhere. They looked like a school of fish that had been killed in a mass oil spill. This much damage even with the World Tree's healing. Everyone thought things would become easier with the World Tree's revival. But the reality was that they could not let their guard down until the very last moment. If Twisted Kindness did not gamble with her life, and if Seo Yuhui did not arrive at the perfect moment, then perhaps they might still be in the middle of a fierce battle.
Philip Muller picked up the divinity of kindness. His hand trembled as he held the orb. He couldn't believe what he was seeing even after confirming Twisted Kindness' death. Agnes sighed and looked around. The battlefield had gotten a lot quieter. The parasite's vanguard, two wings, and the center army had collapsed long ago. It wasn't as if the battles had ended completely, but it was more or less a one-sided massacre.
It was because the parasite queen was fighting Sol Jihu, and with the annihilation of the army commanders and nests, there were no upper-ranked species left that could control the parasite army. It wasn't as if there weren't any upper-ranked species left, but there weren't enough to control the remaining parasite army. As such,
Kung, kung, kung.
At that moment, a thunderous roar rang out from a distance.
Everyone turned their gazes and became solemn as if they promised beforehand.
They had finally come this far.
It's time. Chinzia spoke while preparing a teleportation spell. Jihu! Seo Yuhui hurriedly ran out while cutting through a crowd of people. Looks like she's excited. Chinzia shook her head as she watched Seo Yuhui disappear while shouting, "My Jihu!" Rather than doting on him, would it not be an illness? Un Yuri also shrugged while preparing a teleportation spell. Chinzia grinned. Perhaps the situation called for a celebration since they just took care of a powerful enemy. But she knew it was too early to open up a champagne bottle. There's only one left now. With the final battle left to go, Chinzia spoke just as concisely as always. The main force will move first, and the rest will follow afterward. In the next moment, more than a dozen people vanished simultaneously. They had teleported to the location where the parasite queen and Sol Jihu's battle was taking place. And there. Chapter 482. The Allied force finally arrived at the place of battle. The moment they teleported there, they became lost for words. The lofty walls were half destroyed. In some parts, it was hard to tell whether a wall even existed in the first place. The same went for what was inside the walls, and the space above was distorted like crumpled-up paper. Everyone had expected a fierce battle to have taken place, but the reality surpassed their wildest imaginations. They wanted to help Sol Jihu as quickly as possible. The problem was how. Everyone present was a powerhouse who was among the strongest in paradise. Despite this, only a few were able to follow Sol Jihu and the parasite queen's movements. Baek Haiju was just barely following the battle half a beat late, and Agnes and Hoshino Urara were turning their heads a full beat later. Quang! Another explosion erupted in a nearby area. The earth rumbled just from a simple clash. The portion of the walls crumbled down merely from the resulting shockwave. We have to join that? Wu Lei muttered while looking dumbstruck from the absurd display of strength. No one said a word. It was because they were all thinking the same thing. In fact, even Sol Jihu, who was fighting the parasite queen, thought the same. What should I do? The world tree had successfully migrated over, and all of the army commanders had been taken care of as well. This was truly the best-case scenario. However, the parasite queen did not seem fazed in the slightest. She and Sol Jihu had been fighting constantly since the latter broke through the center army, yet she did not show any signs of being exhausted. It wasn't as if she was getting stronger the longer she fought. But Sol Jihu really felt like he was fighting a vast, endless ocean. I can only use Spear God one more time. Although his stamina and mana recovered with the world tree's migration, the side effect of activating Spear God was a different matter altogether. This was because of the way Spear God worked. It forcefully detonated Sol Jihu's potential after he climbed to the Golden Constellation, with the Spear of Purity's help. It went without saying that the world tree could not heal someone's potential. I have to hide this trump card until that moment. Of course, the battle only seemed unending now. Looking at it from a long-term perspective, it wasn't as if there wasn't a way. What both sides prioritized the most had been time. And as of this moment, time was on the Allied forces' side. It wasn't just because the world tree purified the corrupted land and was healing the Allied force. The heart of the empire was the parasite queen's territory. She made great efforts to create this territory because she was bound by the effect of the imperial oath, which would evict her from the planet.
The only way to keep this time bomb in check was to stay in her own territory. Yet, the World Tree had taken root in this place. There was no doubt that the World Tree was stretching out its roots to the deepest levels of Earth and purifying the land constantly. As proof, the parasite queen began to feel the dormant imperial oath waking up.
She expended additional divinity to suppress it, but it was easy to tell that she would need to use more divinity as time went by. So what would happen the longer this battle dragged out?
Then, what happened in Tiggle Fortress was sure to repeat. Unless the parasite queen were a complete fool, she would want to end this battle before then.
In fact, she really had no choice but to do so.
This was evident from the fact that the parasite queen's attacks had been getting fiercer since a while ago. Was
Sol Jihu overthinking this? He allowed an attack to go through.
Seizing the opportunity, the parasite queen sent Sol Jihu flying.
She looked down just before choosing to chase after Sol Jihu. The main attack force of the Allied force was moving busily to snipe her down. She also felt an immeasurable presence approaching her from a distance. The parasite queen staggered briefly after landing on an unbroken part of the castle wall. It was because intense vertigo suddenly struck her brain. Next, she felt her body become heavy.
After settling in paradise, besides the basic ones, 3 restrictions had been placed on the parasite queen. The first was the imperial oath, which was formed from the power of the chief deity. The second was the divinity she expended permanently to kill Sol Jihu the first time. The third was the inability to recover and regenerate due to the annihilation of the nests and the purification of her territory.
And just now, a fourth restriction was placed on her.
Yggdrasil.
The parasite queen furrowed her brows and glared at the World Tree standing tall in the distance.
Normally, she would not have thought much of something like this, but she had suffered more losses due to her current state. After all, she had to expend additional energy to counter the World Tree's restraints on her divinity. Despite this, the parasite queen was calm as she gazed at her enemies. Her eyes were cold and uncaring as they scanned the members of the Allied force that were rushing in to kill her. This couldn't be helped.
When she had an entire galaxy beneath her feet, she had once fought against an army of millions. A mere few thousand would not be enough to move her in any way. In any case, what was important was that Sol Jihu would no longer be the only one fighting her. The parasite queen stretched out her arms. From her palms, circular waves pulsed inward. And shortly afterward, 2 raging orbs appeared and quickly expanded in size. Goddess of parasitism, chain world destruction. Boom! Once fired, the orbs drew a thick line in the sky and cut across the air in a straight line. There were only 2 orbs. The troops that were charging in paid careful attention to the course of the orbs and prepared to dodge. However, their legs slowed down until eventually coming to a complete stop. Looking up, they dropped their jaws in a daze. It was because they realized how meaningless it was to try and dodge them. From the 2 orbs that shot across the sky like a bullet, dozens of beams of light began to shoot out. They spread out like a fountain, drawing arcs in the air, and then poured down after splitting again and again into dozens of beams. It almost looked like countless umbrella frames opening up at once. By the time the beams of light struck the ground, they had multiplied to an uncountable number. Boom, 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 boom. A fierce, explosive sound resounded in the battlefield. Sky fairies that were hit by the beams did not just have holes drilled into their bodies. They exploded in a spray of blood. Even if the beams somehow missed them, the result was the same. They were swept away by the aftermath of the explosions and bounced up like springs. The main attack force was not doing any better. The barrier Seo Yuhui cast with all her might shattered in 3 seconds, and the rest of the crew quickly threw away any thought of blocking the attack. Of course, that didn't mean everyone could dodge them. "Boss!" Agnes shouted. Chinzia was stuck underground, convulsing sporadically in a pool of blood.
Her eyes rolled back as if she would die any second. Fireflies were gathering on her body, but she was still slow to recover. Agnes quickly picked up Chinzia, bit down on her lower lip, and looked back. The meteor shower resulted in a thick mist of light, which quickly turned into a carpet of blood. By the time the blood mist subsided, there was no one left standing in the range of the bombardment.
It was hard to find even a corpse. Only blood and bits and pieces of flesh remained. Surprisingly, there were still remnants of the light, splitting and shooting out beams of light.
It was indeed a terrifying scene.
Damn it. Sol Jihu's face distorted. It might have been a different story before.
But no matter how strong Sol Jihu was, it was impossible to approach the parasite queen while protecting everyone. This was especially so for a massive range attack like the one before.
Right, he knew this. But should I have activated it? Sol Jihu smacked his lips.
With the previous attack, the parasite queen must have realized he was hesitant to use Spear God. The parasite queen also did not like the current situation.
Her original plan had been to decimate the Allied force and even attack the World Tree.
However, the power of her attack had been halved due to the damned guy who was claiming to be her destined partner.
The parasite queen kicked off the wall. You are.
On the other hand, an earthling who was just at the edge of the explosion's radius slowly raised his head. Seeing the gruesome scene that unfolded in front of him, he swallowed hard and shuddered.
Somehow he was alive.
I can't do this. Feeling strength returning to his body, the man shook his head. A monster had to fight a monster.
A mere human like him would only be killed if he interfered. I have to head back to the main camp and… The man blinked in a daze after staggering up. Before he noticed, a huge shadow had been cast on him.
Just as he raised his head with widened eyes. Quang!
The man's body exploded. Stomped by a giant foot, he was crushed like an insect and died in vain. The parasite queen had leapt into the middle of the battlefield. Not because of anyone, but of her own will. Though this put her in an ideal spot to be surrounded, no one dared to rush in so recklessly. Her previous attack was one reason, but it was also because she was giving off a terrifying pressure just by existing. Of course, that wasn't to say she could be left alone.
The Allied forces' main group began to move.
I expected you to rush in a fit of rage.
The parasite queen glanced at Sol Jihu, who was carefully observing her.
She then looked back at the others and opened her mouth. Hua! Tentacle-shaped gas spewed out of the parasite queen's mouth. Hua! Hua! Goddess of parasitism, infestation. Black gas blossomed out, and the surroundings quickly became rowdy. There was no loud explosion like before. However, anyone that made contact with the gas began to scratch their bodies crazily. One beastman scratched his arm before jumping in fright after seeing his arm melt. One priest used holy spells frantically before coughing up blood and collapsing. Neither wind magic nor barriers worked. Wherever the gas went, the land became corrupted again, and the Allied forces' troops collapsed without being able to do a thing. That wasn't all. The light of destruction that seeped into the earth mixed with the infestation gas scattered in the area. Soon, the parasite queen spread out her wings after absorbing an orb of light and darkness. Goddess of parasitism, coincidentia oppositorum, 28 Chaos. Light and darkness alternated out from the parasite queen. Blink, blink. The light illuminating the world flickered on and off like a street lamp. Ah! What's happening? The already chaotic battlefield became even more chaotic. They were all the way back, but out of the blue, black insect-like masses were creeping up from the bottom of their vision. Eventually, a strange space was created, where both light and sound were isolated. They couldn't see the sky or the battlefield. The comrades standing right next to them had disappeared. All they could see was an endless darkness, and all they could feel was an indescribable, creeping sense of terror.
All who felt this terror slowly submerged into the darkness, almost like they were being swallowed by fear.
Clang!
The longsword in Teresa's hand fell.
She had not dropped it.
It had fallen. When she looked down with a look of despair, she could see her right hand, of which only the ring finger and pinky finger remained.
The rest of it was gone, as if someone took a big bite out of it. "Ah!" Teresa stammered. Tears filled her eyes. She expected the worst, but she never thought it would be this bad. "We can't win." The wall she saw was incomparably taller than Twisted Kindness. Only after seeing it for herself did she finally realize just how absurd it was that Sol Jihu was holding the Parasite Queen back until now. How are we supposed to? The feeling of her existence being devoured by the darkness, the feeling of disappearing, was enough to make even the strong-hearted Teresa fall into despair. All she could do was drop her head and let things happen.
It was then. A light flashed in front of her half-closed eyes. The flash spread out slowly before revealing a brilliant golden light.
Eventually. Peetst!
Quote exclamation mark quote.
Teresa's eyes shot open. She felt the darkness surrounding her shatter in an instant. Blinking in a daze, Teresa looked like she was at a loss for what to do. She almost looked drowsy, as if she had just woken up from a long nap. She wasn't the only one with such an expression.
Everyone had pretty much the same face.
But soon, their eyes widened. Golden lightning bolts were striking down from the sky. Their vision returned to normal. Rumble. Boom. They could hear again as well, rumbles and booms ringing out clearly. This is.
Seeing the lightning bolts destroying the darkness, Teresa's eyes flashed.
Yu-wah. The surging lightning rose into the sky as if to respond to the roar. Everyone turned their heads and fixated their gaze on one person. Sol Jihu pointed his raised spear down below. Then, lightning bolts rose from the surroundings and gathered together to form a giant dragon. The lightning dragon shot forward while crackling terrifyingly. The Parasite Queen lowered her center of gravity and brought her wings together like interlocked hands, forming a shield. Qua! What happened next made everyone's eyes widen. She was being pushed back. The Parasite Queen was being pushed back, leaving behind a deep track on the ground. It was just that, but the feeling of fighting an unwinnable battle disappeared. Teresa clenched her teeth and used her hand that was enveloped in amber light to pick up the longsword she dropped. The Parasite Queen was indeed a lot stronger than Twisted Kindness. But it was different now. Of course, it might be more difficult, but it might also be easier. Because Sol Jihu was here. Just let me get married. Teresa regained her energy and kicked off the ground with a yelp. After coming to a temporary halt, the Allied force began to move once again. Chapter 483. Light engulfed the battlefield. Explosions rang out, and screams erupted everywhere. Once the light faded, a deafening roar filled the air again. Many died each time the Parasite Queen moved, but the Allied force remained spirited. The Parasite Queen's eyes narrowed when she saw yet another wave of soldiers surging forward. After she killed 100, 1,000 more appeared. After she killed 1,000, 10,000 more appeared. She could finally understand how Sol Jihu must have felt back then, in the Empire. To face an entire army alone meant that the Parasite Queen had to divide her attention accordingly. In contrast, Sol Jihu wasn't very concerned about protecting his comrades. His sole target was the Parasite Queen, and that hadn't changed from the start. Quang! The force of the reinforced sword Qi flung the Parasite Queen across the battlefield again. She hit a wall, and when she raised her head. Opening square bracket question mark closing square bracket. Her vision was wavering. The Parasite Queen furrowed her brows. She wasn't mistaken. Though small in size, a heat haze was definitely rising from parts of her body. This was a sign that her body was nearing its physical limit. It was only natural. She had used too much of her divinity at once, and the World Tree still had a profound effect on her.
The damage from Sol Jihu's attacks could not be overlooked either. The parasite queen lifted her head and looked up at the sky.
Then her gaze fell again to the enemies rushing toward her. Opening square bracket ellipsis closing square bracket. She suddenly felt empty. A not too distant future unfolded before her eyes. In it, she fought and fought until finally collapsing, just like Twisted Kindness did. Was there a meaning to all this?
Because, as she saw it, no matter how long this war lasted, the result would be the same. The parasite queen sighed as she stared at the enemy, who was now only a short distance away. She had always resorted to the most logical decisions whenever a crisis befell her. Although the outcomes of the said decisions hadn't always been great. Under stress and pressed for time, she returned to her habit again and reached a bold decision once more. She decided to knock over the glass of water. Not much was going to change in terms of tactics. Her plan was to crush the enemy with absolute force, as always. But this time, she couldn't afford to be as lenient as the last time. According to her calculations, the last attack should have wiped out at least half of the Allied force. But it didn't. So this time, she'd have to be a bit more attentive. Thinking so, the parasite queen took a step forward. The vanguard faltered at the sight. There was something threatening about the way the parasite queen stood completely still. But what was more frightening was the unsettling energy brewing in the air. Energy that could not be measured by the perception of such trivial creatures like themselves. Kung! Suddenly, the earth sank, forming a deep hole. The parasite queen straightened her posture at the center of the crater. She raised her chin with her arms wide open. With her eyes fixed on the sky, she craned her neck and shouted at the top of her lungs. Kia! Her voice, full of unsettling energy, spread far and wide and resonated across the battlefield until it pierced the sky and reached outer space. The ear-splitting shriek seemed to inform the whole world of her position as the goddess of parasitism, who once conquered the entire galaxy. It was then. Quang! Suddenly, a sphere the size of a skyscraper burst the ground open as it soared into the air. The sphere, made of flames that melted even space itself, emitted a blazing heat as if it were the sun. Mushroom-shaped smoke clouds shot up a beat later. That's Sol Jihu, who was preparing for the next attack, widened his eyes. Of course, he recognized the shape. This was the technique that destroyed more than half of the Allied forces during the Tigel Fortress War. He had no time to think. He only knew he had to stop this attack at all costs. Seeing that even the capital was shaking, Sol Jihu immediately used Thousand Thunder and activated Hell-Severing and Supernova Explosion. At the same time, flames swept across the battlefield like hurricanes, devouring the Allied force. The goddess of parasitism, third impact. Quare. The world turned crimson. The raging firestorm engulfed the entire battlefield and caused a massive explosion. It was like watching a titan spread a red carpet over the entire Imperial territory or seeing thousands of fighter jets bombarding the battlefield with fierce intensity. Everything that the fire touched exploded and then melted until nothing remained. Sol Jihu's lightning wasn't even visible amid the blazing fire. Woo! Even the World Tree lamented in sorrow at the sight of total annihilation. The explosion quickly swept the battlefield and swallowed even the Allies' headquarters. But this was only the first impact. Ah! The sky and the earth flipped. Everyone's vision was reversed. Just a moment ago, they were all standing on the ground, but now they were falling. Even before they could make sense of anything, the flames soared into the air and swallowed them whole. Only a few had managed to regain control of their bodies and escape the effects of the second impact. Sol Jihu was one of them. As soon as the force of the second impact reached him, Sol Jihu activated Grand Cosmic Shift to recover his balance. But that was all there was. Sol Jihu recalled that this technique caused a total of 3 explosions.
There was still one left. It was then.
As soon as Sol Jihu looked down, he doubted his eyes.
The fire scorching the battlefield was rising. This wasn't an illusion.
The fire was really soaring up as if someone was pushing it manually, up where he was. A hot wind brushed past Sol Jihu. Could it be?
His suspicion proved to be true.
The first impact, the second impact, and
Sol Jihu.
The third impact and its terrifying aftershock were all heading to one place.
Ah! Sol Jihu finally realized who the parasite queen was aiming for with this attack. Flames blocked his way before he could do anything.
The three forces merged into one and began to condense as they circled around Sol Jihu.
The circle quickly closed in on its target. Sol Jihu was moving even before a coherent thought fully formed in his head. His entire body was emitting golden light. He had been saving it for later, but his body sensed danger and automatically activated Spear God. Everywhere he turned, he saw a sea of fire. Pillars of fire rose into the air like a dozen volcanoes erupting in unison. Raging winds swirled around him from all directions.
All the fire in the world surrounded Sol Jihu.
He felt as if he were trapped in the sun. Please. Sol Jihu tried everything he could.
He tried to find a way out by changing his course a dozen times and even went as far as to activate ethereal shift consecutively.
But in the end, nothing worked. The range of flames was so wide that there simply was no way out. Both Seo Yuhui's barrier and Un Yuri's magic melted as soon as they were activated.
The size of the fire was more infinite than Sol Jihu's limitlessness. Thousand stream convergence wasn't helpful either, as the concept of flow lost all its meaning in the face of absolute power.
Damn it, damn it.
Panicking, Sol Jihu tried to force himself through the fire.
However, cheek! Awk! A scream of pain escaped Sol Jihu's throat as he quickly jerked away. All the flames rushed towards Sol Jihu as if they had been waiting for this moment. Hook!
As he barely managed to swallow his breath, he felt his throat getting roasted.
What drove Sol Jihu even crazier was that the flames of heaven and earth were still steadily approaching. He knew he had to escape before they got too close. But all Sol Jihu could do now was fly higher. He couldn't go down. That would just drag everyone else into the fire.
At last, the fire arrived before his eyes.
He had run out of room to move. He knew the flames would soon catch up even if he ran now. Kook! Sol Jihu's entire body, glowing gold, emitted large sparks. Crackle!
His anti-evil energy, enhanced with the authorities of God-slaying and gluttony, soared high into the air. But even that wasn't enough to overturn the situation. The fire destroyed the anti-evil energy at a much faster rate than the lightning essence swallowed the fire. The parasite queen's divinity was overpowering even the authority of gluttony.
Sol Jihu was soaked in sweat from head to toe. A scorching smell filled the air. His flesh was being baked.
As the fire demon slowly devoured his body.
This is.
Sol Jihu sensed for the first time that death was near. He clenched his teeth and swung the spear of purity, but even the spear was burning with heat.
It had come to the point where merely holding the spear was too painful for him. No, no. I can't, not anymore.
At that moment, the golden light surrounding Sol Jihu's body shrunk in an instant.
The heat on his skin grew stronger. Sol Jihu's grip around the spear of purity quickly loosened. It was truly an absolute power that he was witnessing. Quote. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. There was nothing more Sol Jihu could do at this point. Quare. He merely watched the fire advance. Ah!
Strangely enough, this didn't feel like the end. His body would probably turn to ashes before he felt any pain. As the fire devoured both his body and soul, Sol Jihu shut his eyes tight.
And then?
What happened? After a moment of silence, Sol Jihu's eyes flinched. Am I dead?
It didn't feel that way. He could still feel the heat surrounding him.
But something was definitely different. The intensity of the fire had decreased noticeably. He could also hear the whooshing sound of a blade around him.
And then a strange phenomenon occurred in which his body moved on its own, against his will. Perhaps the heat had already melted away all his senses, and this was his body struggling for life? As he thought to himself, "You fuckhead,"
a familiar voice resounded inside his head. "Cut the bullshit and open your damn eyes." Sol Jihu's eyes opened in a flash. He froze in astonishment. Wow, what the? His right hand, holding the spear of purity, was moving at lightning speed. The tip of the spear slashed left, right, up, down, and diagonally.
It was so fast that the thin layer formed by the spearhead was visible to the naked eye. Sol Jihu had never mastered such a technique and didn't think he could, even if he wanted to. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The familiar voice spoke again. "First you throw yourself into the fire." If Sol Jihu wasn't mistaken.
"And now you're just standing there?"
The voice echoing in his head belonged to Black Sol Jihu.
What's going on? What do you think?"
"Look ahead." Sol Jihu turned his head forward.
There, he saw a message floating in the air.
Innate ability. Future gauging 9 eyes has been activated.
Sol Jihu blinked. He knew that whenever future vision was activated, Black Sol Jihu's consciousness replaced his own.
And during that time, he remembered nothing. Wait a minute. In the past, however, there had been one instance in which he remained conscious even while future vision was active. It was when he was escaping from the Empire.
At that time, even after the effect of the future vision wore off, he was able to roughly remember what Black Sol Jihu had done.
The reason is simple.
Back then, you were weak.
Black Sol Jihu's voice explained.
But now you're strong. What do you mean?
Simply put, it's a matter of difference in realms. In the past, your consciousness couldn't handle me, but now it can.
Ah! He recalled it was during the parasite's wheel tactic that he almost achieved Trinity harmony for the first time.
Anyway,
said Black Sol Jihu, a hint of annoyance in his voice.
Look, I'll explain later, so can we focus on the battle for now?
'Cause it looks like my spear barrier is going to break soon.
That was a wake-up call for Sol Jihu. He turned his gaze and saw the fire trying to wriggle its way through the barrier.
But, oh, please, just shut up. I know what you want to say.
This was what killed me.
Black Sol Jihu licked his lips.
So we need to work together, combine our powers.
Judging from your current state, I'd say there's a good chance we'll make it out alive.
You even activated Spear God.
Finally, confusion disappeared from Sol Jihu's eyes, who then began to focus. The realm of absolute perfection that he himself failed to reach. If only he could attain that technique. You should have come sooner.
Sol Jihu grumbled quietly, then tightened his grip around the spear of purity. Were you sad because I came too late? Stop being a baby and grab it already. Slowly, Sol Jihu felt the control of his body return to him. You're gonna be the one moving. And I'll be the one to support you. He felt as if Black Sol Jihu had put his hand on his arm. And it was comfortable. This was what they did every day in the path of the soul.
You ready? Sol Jihu smiled at Black Sol Jihu's question.
Yes.
Just a moment ago, he thought everything was over, but now he felt secure.
All his fears were gone, and his heart began to fill with confidence, all because Black Sol Jihu was with him. All right, then. On the count of 3. 1, 2. Sol Jihu's eyes, reflecting the fire, began to shine. 3.
His left eye radiated a golden light, and his right eye glowed crimson.
Let's go. And at that moment. Level 9 Divine Spear, Class Ability, Trinity Harmony. Level 8 Spear Demon, Class Ability, Seamless Sublimity.
Sol Jihu's feet kicked the air with all their might.
Chapter 484. It's over.
That was everyone's thought when the terrifying flame swallowed Sol Jihu.
Ah! Ah! No!
Gasps and lamentations escaped the mouths of the Allied force.
Finally.
The parasite queen gave a smile of satisfaction.
It was then. Sol Jihu suddenly shot out of the flames, which were seemingly devouring him. The parasite queen snorted. As far as she was concerned, this was only a desperate final struggle.
There was no way Sol Jihu would escape after being trapped in that boundless fire. However, the queen's conviction soon turned into disbelief.
Sol Jihu began to shake like a willow branch as he was shooting into the air.
The flames that enveloped him from the sides brushed past him without being able to touch his body, and when Sol Jihu swung the spear of purity while spinning, the flames vanished into thin air. When he turned his body halfway in the next moment, a flame that dropped from the sky narrowly grazed past him. With the spear of purity already on the right track, the flame was cut in half by the spear blade. Sol Jihu continued to soar and then changed course right before he clashed with the flames that were swarming in from all sides.
It was as if he drifted hard to turn a corner.
Having lost their target, the flames crashed into each other and exploded. That wasn't all. An intense heat rushed in from the front. Sol Jihu did not try to dodge it.
In fact, he spun even faster and jumped into the eye of the storm. A storm brewed inside the storm.
The storm of heat expanded like a balloon, unable to handle the storm that was growing inside. Soon, the heat storm exploded.
Sol Jihu appeared, doing an upright spin.
The surrounding flames swirled following the direction of Sol Jihu's spin and quickly disappeared.
What? The parasite queen gasped.
Her shocked eyes followed Sol Jihu's movements. Sol Jihu did not stop.
To be more precise,
he did not let even a single part of his body stay unmoving, not even for a fraction of a second.
He changed direction every time he turned his head and changed altitude every time he moved his legs.
Meanwhile, he continued to shoot out reinforced sword chi with his left hand and swung the spear of purity with his right hand.
His body shook constantly. Water flowed from top to bottom, in one direction only.
However, going beyond flowing, the current was moving as Sol Jihu pleased.
It drew a gradual curve at times, going up and abruptly falling.
It seemed to turn left but then took a sudden right.
It was indeed an unnatural scene,
almost like watching a fighter plane piloted by a genius shoot down dozens of enemy planes. Seeing the flames subside gradually, the parasite queen's eyes trembled faintly.
Sol Jihu's movements had changed noticeably.
Just like how a software update allowed powerful hardware to bring out its full potential, there were no superfluous movements in Sol Jihu's fluid motion. He almost looked like a child playing around in the fire.
War!
With the final bit of flame flickering off, the sky that had turned red regained its azure color. At the same time, feelings of joy and sorrow befell the two sides.
A loud cheer erupted from the ground.
The incredible aerial battle was one thing, but everyone was overjoyed that Sol Jihu had overcome the parasite queen's attack.
Whew!
Sol Jihu heaved out a heavy sigh.
See? I told you. You can do it.
Black Sol Jihu's voice rang out in his head.
Sol Jihu nodded before gazing down. His eyes gleamed after witnessing white smoke rising from the parasite queen's body. Though she was still standing firmly on two legs, the smoke was making her body look hazy. It was proof that she had pushed herself to carry out the previous attack. Good, good.
With this, now both sides have used their trump cards. That's big. Trump cards? The parasite queen must have expended most of the divinity at her disposal with that attack.
On the other hand, you activated Spear God for the final time.
Black Sol Jihu continued.
What's important is that your Spear God is still active.
You're at a clear advantage right now.
In other words, Sol Jihu now held the initiative. Stay on your toes. There's no way of knowing what will happen later.
Meaning, Sol Jihu had to end this fight while Spear God was active. But how long will it last? Sol Jihu tensed up when he thought this battle would end soon. Who would be the one standing at the end of this fight? The parasite queen will put up a fight until the very end. Suddenly, his arm moved. Sol Jihu blinked. His spear blade was pointing at the Allied forces' main unit.
Use them. Use them as your meat shield.
They should be able to buy you a few seconds at the very least. Sol Jihu furrowed his brows. He was instinctively turned off by the proposal. However, he didn't say anything.
Though cruel, he knew it was the realistic choice. I know what you're thinking, but they're going to do it even if you say no. Black Sol Jihu spoke, sounding pleased.
It looks like they realized what they have to do.
It was just like he said.
Hugo, who barely recovered from the brink of death after taking the parasite queen's attack, had a complicated expression.
He was scared. He was afraid. And a sense of despair filled his head as he realized it would be impossible to win.
However, his mind changed after watching Sol Jihu.
His mindset had been wrong from the beginning.
How could they not defeat the parasite queen with their numbers?
He wanted to live more than anything else.
He wanted to survive this final battle, return triumphant, and lead a life in paradise.
No.
He shouldn't have thought that way. Because the enemy wasn't someone he could hope something like that from.
Even Sol Jihu was fighting with his life on the line, so unless he put his life at risk too, he would not be able to even set a single foot in battle. Of course, that didn't mean that Hugo wasn't looking at things realistically.
At this point, he fully acknowledged that he was not the parasite queen's match.
Never mind fighting her, it was a question of whether he would be able to injure her.
But he didn't care.
Compared to the parasite queen, he was lesser than an amoeba.
If he could hold a god of her caliber back for even a second, or at the very least distract her for a moment and give Sol Jihu a tiny window of opportunity, then he would have done well beyond his value.
Resolved, Hugo gripped his halberd. It was then. Oi, Hugo.
Cho Hong, who similarly recovered from her injuries, got up while shaking off the fireflies on her body. We haven't died yet, right?
Hugo's eyes widened.
Then wouldn't it be fine if we died once?
Hearing this, Hugo grinned. It seemed Cho Hong thought the same thing. I'm a bit worried about the death penalty, but… Hugo nodded. It should be fine.
And he spoke assertively.
Sol promised to revive Dylan and Ian once this war ends. Then he'll revive us too, definitely.
Yeah, I just can imagine the number of contribution points that bitch will provide.
We even acquired 4 divinities from this war. There should be nothing for us to worry about.
Cho Hong and Hugo cackled.
All right then.
Soon, seeing the parasite queen stretch her hands out to the front, Cho Hong gripped her thorn of steel.
Let's go die.
Just don't get yourself killed before you can do anything.
I should be saying that to you. Cho Hong and Hugo kicked off the ground simultaneously. At the same time, orbs of light gathered on the parasite queen's palms. No, they stopped just as they were about to. Kuhuk.
The parasite queen dropped her head and coughed out a mouthful of bodily fluid.
Her hands fell, and her body staggered. The steam rising from her body also became a bit thicker.
This appearance fanned the Allied forces' flames. The seemingly undefeatable enemy had shown weakness.
Yu-wa.
Despite being afraid to even approach her before, the soldiers of the Allied force began to charge toward the staggering parasite queen.
Kiyu. The parasite queen frowned. Lowly insects. Rather than backing off, she took a step forward.
Quang.
Her foot stomped down on the ground. The earth cracked and rumbled, and dozens of people lost their balance and fell. You dare to act so arrogant in my presence? The parasite queen swung her arm. A fierce gale cut through the air and sent dozens of people flying. She tilted her head up, howled, and then spread out her wings.
The 14 pairs of wings stretched out, curling flexibly like whips and fluttering in the air.
Ku-hook!
Struck squarely in the stomach, Cho-hong's body bent at a 90-degree angle as she flew back.
Even that was only because of Cho-hong's sturdy body. An archer who was hit with her was cut in 2 halves. Awk!
A bone wing pierced Hugo's thigh.
It did not stop there and continued to move.
With how many there were, over a dozen people were skewered in a split second. The parasite queen shook her wings.
Then, the ones groaning on the wings poured down on the charging enemies.
An empty hole appeared wherever the wings swept through, and members of the Allied force were hooked up like fish every time the wings struck down.
They were then sent flying in all directions or slammed down to the ground.
Hundreds died in the blink of an eye.
Still, there were tens of thousands remaining.
They rushed in like a tidal wave as soon as a gap was created, and they steadily got closer. Eventually, they reached the parasite queen. Then, just as she was about to kick the soldiers who dared to point their spears at her, the parasite queen furrowed her brows. A string of spiderwebs came flying in from the left, binding her legs.
A reinforced sword chi emanating the power of holy water was flying in from the back.
That wasn't all.
You!
The parasite queen instantly raised her arm and clenched her fist. You dare!
Ack! Yuri, who was preparing a spell in the sky above her, flinched.
Despite being a long distance away, she felt the sensation of being squeezed by a terrifying pressure. Feeling like she would be squeezed to a pulp at this rate, she quickly cancelled recital and escaped using teleport. Talk. The parasite queen managed to take care of the biggest concern, but that resulted in the enemy landing their attacks from the front.
Although the spears of the soldiers were blocked by her outer carapace, the fact that their spears managed to touch her hurt her pride.
The problem was that she had to move before she could vent her frustration.
She pulled on the spiderwebs to take care of the apostle of pride, but the quick-witted Agnes cut off her webs and escaped. I won't let you escape.
The parasite queen twisted her body with great force. Plop! Baek Haiju, who was aiming for the back of the parasite queen's head, let go of the Tathagata spear and fell to the ground. When she raised her head, bone wings with fang-like tentacles on their tips filled her vision.
And clang! She also saw a huge spark of lightning scattering in front of her. You pesky brat!
The parasite queen screamed in a high-pitched voice. Up, down, up, down. Black Soul Jihu also shouted. Soul Jihu cut in between the goddess and the woman, 5 metallic rings resounding from the top and bottom.
Lower your center of gravity. Move diagonally. Soul Jihu bent his knees and took an abrupt left turn. Aim for her Achilles tendon. The spear of purity aimed for the parasite queen's ankle. Kiyu. The parasite queen raised her leg in a hurry. This was the first time she had avoided Soul Jihu's attack out of necessity in close-ranged combat. Although she stomped down immediately afterward, Soul Jihu already had the spear of purity up by that point. What happened? The parasite queen gritted her teeth while locked in a contest of strength. Just what did you do? She asked again. Why does it feel like I'm facing a joint attack? Soul Jihu's eyes widened. Oh, that? Then, the corner of his lips curled up. All right, I'll tell you. Opening square bracket question mark closing square bracket. Here's what happened. At that moment, the parasite queen flinched. Croc. She felt a sharp sensation cutting through her side. Baek Haiju had retrieved the Tathagata spear before she noticed and was swinging it fiercely. So he was just buying time. Damned brat. The parasite queen turned her body to minimize the damage, but her side had been cut deeply and poured out blood. She swung her palm in a fit of rage, but it was blocked by Soul Jihu's spear of purity. And above him, a jade-colored sword chi came piercing in.
Quang! Struck on her chest, the parasite queen was pushed back. This was the first clean hit she had suffered from anyone besides Sol Jihu.
Not once, but twice. She quickly opened her wings again, but even that was not successful. Ki-yu!
Wu Lei had slashed down with his greatsword, covering her body at the same time. Then, everyone else gathered together, throwing their weapons on the ground and clinging onto her with their lives on the line. They figured this was better than approaching her without a plan and dying. Seeing this, White Tiger also jumped in and clung onto a wing. Hundreds of people joined the group in an instant. Un Yuri's magic, Agnes' threads, and Chinzia's Valkyries all aimed for the wings. It was a simple yet effective method. As members of the Allied force continued to cling onto her no matter how many were killed, the bone wings swirling around the surroundings slowly began to creak.
A look of shock began to fill the parasite queen's eyes. And when some of her wings became so damaged that she could no longer ignore it, she quickly retracted them and fell back. Her eyes widened as she distanced herself. I, the goddess of parasitism, am running away. The moment she realized this, she stopped moving back. Alright. Standing tall, her eyes gleamed. Such a desperate struggle. Do you really think that is enough to take me down? She put her hands together as if to offer up a prayer and then straightened out her wings. As she roused the remainder of her energy, blood spurted out from her 7 orifices and gaping wounds, and the steam rising from her turned into smoke and soared into the sky. However, the parasite queen ignored it completely. In the next moment, the tip of her wings curved in before the ends opened up slightly. The opened holes created 30 centimeter long magic circles from which a large palm-shaped tentacle sprouted out. Goddess of parasitism, infinite Buddha. Let's bring this to an end. Along with the parasite queen's shout, 28 magic circles shone simultaneously. Sol Jihu's eyes widened. Chapter 485. 14 pairs of bone wings moved like the hands of an asura. He saw nothing. He heard nothing. But he still felt the presence of a giant hand trying to grab his body. Slap! A huge palm smacked Sol Jihu, and the shock pushed him back. He had instinctively raised the spear of purity in front of him to defend himself, but blood still dripped from his ears and nose. In addition to the physical pain, he could almost feel his soul escape his body. The next attack surprised Sol Jihu even more. Palms flew at him from 108 different angles, all at the same time. Sol Jihu quickly connected with Black Sol Jihu to dodge. They utilized several different techniques but could not avoid all the palms. Damn it! This can't be helped. Get ready for a... Before Black Sol Jihu could even finish his sentence, a pair of palms slapped Sol Jihu's back with a terrifying force. Both men let out a yelp of pain. Fuck! What the hell is this? Even Black Sol Jihu was puzzled. He had never experienced anything like this in his previous life. Just keep moving. Only after barely escaping did the whole situation come into Sol Jihu's sight. Quang, 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 quang. Sol Jihu fell speechless at the sight of an endless series of explosions rocking the battlefield. 10 pairs are for us, and the other 4 are for... Damn it. It was just as Black Sol Jihu said. 20 bone wings targeted Sol Jihu, and the other 8 were flying towards the others. Each time the parasite queen's wings spun, countless lost their lives. Even the core members weren't an exception. Boom! Following the sound of an explosion, Kazuki was thrown into the air. But Sol Jihu couldn't even afford to check his condition, because... Boom! Almost immediately, another explosion occurred. This time, Marcel Guionia was flung across the battlefield, his legs torn from his body. Mr. Guionia. What remained of Marcel Guionia rolled across the ground a few times before turning his head towards Sol Jihu's voice.
His lips drew back in a faint smile as he stared at Sol Jihu in the air. "I'm so RRY."
His eyes closed and he stopped moving. A long scream rang out before Sol Jihu could even recover from the shock. "Maria! Fuik! Kwang!" When Sol Jihu turned around, Maria was no longer there.
He only saw 2 bloody feet partially buried in a palm-shaped pit. Despite the considerable distance between her and the enemy, Maria still got hit.
It was proof that this technique was indiscriminate and fast beyond imagination. And even now, it was accelerating, flying toward the Allies' headquarters at a terrifying speed.
To make matters worse, the golden light surrounding Sol Jihu's body began to flicker. This was a sign that Spear God was coming to an end. You sure do act like you have a ton of time to spare." Black Sol Jihu's sarcastic voice rang in Sol Jihu's head as gusts of wind blew past him.
"I know. But
how could she still be so energetic?"
Sol Jihu clenched his teeth and glared at the parasite queen. The origin of this technique was her bone wings.
As such, it seemed evident that he had to get close to the enemy to stop it.
But Sol Jihu couldn't quite figure out how he would do that. He knew that if he approached her, all the wings would target him. He couldn't even dodge 10. He didn't think he could dodge 14.
"I just don't see any opening."
"Then perhaps we should make one."
That was when a silvery voice echoed in his ears. It belonged to Russell.
"I feel like I've already told you this, but take a look below."
Sol Jihu's gaze fell to the ground at Black Sol Jihu's voice.
His eyes widened in an instant.
There, he saw his comrades resisting against the parasite queen's attack.
Seo Yuhui, Un Yuri, Chinzia, and Philip Muller had formed a barrier together. Even though the barrier had already been more or less destroyed, they struggled to maintain it to the end. Even going as far as to calculate the angles at which the attacks were coming in. All 4 of them knew just how terrifying the parasite queen was, obviously. They were also aware of the deaths of their comrades.
But in spite of everything, they remained calm and composed.
Sol Jihu finally realized the reason for their tenacity.
His comrades had been telling him to use them for a while now.
The moment he realized this, he was already descending, towards his comrades.
"He's here."
The moment Philip Muller shouted, the 3 magicians exchanged glances. There was no time to waste. Philip Muller crafted a magic circle, and Chinzia summoned the Valkyries as they charged together toward the enemy.
The sudden and simultaneous attacks from the 2 executors caught the parasite queen's attention.
She wasn't afraid of them, of course. She merely saw this as an opportunity to exterminate 2, relatively, annoying bugs simultaneously.
However, this shift in attention gave a certain person a chance to attack.
The raging storm briefly subsided. Hugo gripped his halberd tight.
Thanks to the World Tree, the wound in his stomach had been healed completely.
Nothing was holding him back now. He'd already done this once before. There was no reason why he couldn't do it again. 2 screams rang out in succession as Hugo kicked the ground.
Uaaaaaaargh.
With a roar, he began to sprint. Un Yuri's spell and Yi Sol A's aura helped increase Hugo's speed to keep him from falling behind Sol Jihu.
"This fight will end in an instant."
Black Sol Jihu's voice rang in Sol Jihu's head as he, too, began to run. "You're running out of mana.
Don't waste it on anything else but that." He urged Sol Jihu to save his strength for the crucial moment, even if it meant that he had to sacrifice his comrades.
"This is especially important.
Don't go off on your own just because you're pissed.
Do you understand?"
Sol Jihu nodded instead of answering. At that moment, the parasite queen turned her head toward the storm rushing at her.
Seeing their terrifying speed, she quickly moved her bone wings. Palms flew in from everywhere. Sol Jihu swung his arm. The Spear of Purity spewed out dozens of sword chi as several massive explosions erupted in succession around Sol Jihu. Suddenly, a palm ripped through the smoke. Hugo's eyes widened. He clenched his teeth and brought his halberd forward. Crack!
The shining halberd shattered into a million pieces and then scattered into the air.
Hugo, who received the attack with his entire body, was far from fine.
Blood spurted from all over his body as the force of the blow pushed him back.
Q.
He wobbled as if about to fall, but managed to pull himself back up seconds before it was too late, thanks to Cho-hong and Phi Sora, who each extended their arms to support Hugo from behind.
Val. Hugo's blood-covered face winced with pain, but his lips curved into a smile. Suddenly, he felt grateful for all the time he had spent trying to climb that slope. It was because he had worked so hard to reach that peak that he was able to take this step forward. Valhalla ah! He was able to run again, holding what remained of his weapon. A look of perplexity crossed the Parasite Queen's face. Smack! There was nothing Hugo could do about the palm that flew in at him the next moment. He struggled to fall sideways so as not to obstruct Sol Jihu's way. Sol Jihu passed Hugo as he fell. Go! Hugo's hand flailed a few times in the air in search of Sol Jihu's back before brushing past Sol Jihu's right arm. Sol Jihu glanced briefly at Hugo's thick arm, and the blood splattered across it, then turned his head forward again. Another palm was coming for him. He clenched his teeth and fired reinforced sword chi. I'm here! Yuri shouted and flew up toward the newly appeared palm. Freeze! World! When she finished her last spell, a snowstorm was unleashed onto the battlefield. But it did not last long. Both the freezing cold and Yuri's voice quickly faded into silence. In the meantime, all Sol Jihu felt was the warmth of the blood splattering on his flesh. At least she managed to delay the Parasite Queen's attack once. Although it lasted for only a brief moment, it was more than enough time for Sol Jihu to move forward. Sol Jihu soon reached the center of the attack range. He was now close enough to see the Parasite Queen's face clearly. The raging winds came to an abrupt halt. The Parasite Queen's attack had stopped. It was nothing to rejoice about. All 14 pairs of wings were pointing at Sol Jihu now. Get lost! With a roar, the Parasite Queen resumed the attack with even more ferocity than before. Left, right, up, and down. The palms came from all directions. Sol Jihu destroyed them as quickly as possible, but the number of palms continued to remain high. Suddenly, Cho-hong and Phi Sora stopped simultaneously as if this had been part of their plan from the beginning. Rahi and Vlad Halep also stopped and turned around. All four of them jumped into the air at the same time. Boom, 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 boom. The palms that were coming down towards Sol Jihu burst in the air. He didn't even hear a scream. He didn't even have time to look up. Sol Jihu just ran silently through the rain of blood falling from the sky. The Parasite Queen's eyelashes trembled. She found herself backing away again. The remaining opponents were 6, including Sol Jihu. At this rate, it wouldn't be long before the brightest star reached her. And at that moment, all hesitation disappeared from the Parasite Queen's face. She quickly stepped back as if running away, operating her bone wings. Pride was the least of her concerns now. Her only wish was to remain standing when all was over, as she always had. There were only about 10 steps left between Sol Jihu and the Parasite Queen. Hoo-ah! It was then. Another round of palms was fired again from the Parasite Queen's body. The first scream that rang out belonged to Yi Sol-ah. Aura! Forget about me and... She sensed a palm's presence aiming at Sol Jihu's back and threw herself towards its course. Sol Jihu couldn't hear what she shouted at the end, for she drifted away too quickly. I'm up next! Suddenly, 5 brilliant colors filled Sol Jihu's view. The Arcus spirit wrapped himself around Sol Jihu's body to protect his partner from incoming attacks.
But as Black Soul Jihu had said, the protection lasted only a few seconds. As more and more palms flew towards their way, the colors faded quickly until, at last, the Arcus spirit collapsed with a burst of light. Despite his sacrifice, the palms still remained, and more were coming toward him.
There seemed to be no end in sight to the influx of palms. But not everyone was down yet. Following the sound of a robe fluttering in the air, a green reinforced sword chi shot forward. It had come from Baek Haiju's spear. And when the remaining 10 steps were reduced to 7. Jihu. A soft voice brushed past Soul Jihu's ears. His view suddenly brightened. Soul Jihu almost looked back but stopped. Both Little Chick and Baek Haiju were gone, but the barrier around him was still strangely strong. He felt a warmth touch his right arm. With the help of aura, Seo Yuhui had finally caught up with Soul Jihu. With a smile, she gave Soul Jihu a small nod, then turned her head forward. "Aura, please." A gust of wind blew past them. Seo Yuhui armed Soul Jihu with layers of barriers and then threw herself in front of him, clasping the proof of castitas tightly. And pung, 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 clang. When the barriers shattered in just 4 blows, Seo Yuhui was no longer there. Soul Jihu was now completely alone. The remaining steps, 6. He couldn't have come this far without his comrades' sacrifices. With a renewed determination, he quickly gathered his remaining strength and was about to activate Thousand Thunder, when suddenly… "Wait, hold on. Pook!" He saw a palm, and that was it. His vision shook violently. His tense body quickly lost its momentum. Kook! Ah! Both Black Soul Jihu and Russell let out a groan. That palm was not a part of Infinite Buddha. They had already destroyed all the palms. It was just that the Parasite Queen had suddenly stopped. She read Soul Jihu's movements and stopped running, and instead chose to strike the enemy with her own hands at the very moment that he was about to launch his technique. It was then, as Soul Jihu was about to lose his focus. "What are you doing?" An angry shout rang out. "I've told you countless times not to let your guard down until the end." The voice pulled Soul Jihu back to reality. He managed to keep his consciousness awake and opened his eyes. His body, which had almost fallen, was being pulled up by an invisible force. This was neither his nor Black Soul Jihu's doing. Wait for one more step. Finally, Soul Jihu discovered the strands of silk wrapped around his arms. These strands were lifting him back to his feet. Apostle of Superbia. The Parasite Queen's enraged shout shook the battlefield. "Hurry! Kwang!" Agnes' voice was cut short by an explosion. Her glasses shattered to pieces and scattered in the air. Soul Jihu shook his head as if to clear it, then fixed his gaze forward. Only 5 more steps left. The palms were all gone now, and the Parasite Queen was standing still. This was his chance. Soul Jihu stamped the ground with all his might. Peetst! Lightning sparked from his 2 legs, which then swiftly glided forward. At the same time, as he tightened his grip around the Spear of Purity, someone put his hands on the back of Soul Jihu's hands. "Now!" With Black Soul Jihu's shout, Soul Jihu's eyes shot wide open. No fancy technique was needed at this point. He only rushed forward like a bolt of lightning, bent his arms back over his head as far as he could, and then launched his spear toward his target with every ounce of strength left in him. The spear, emitting a glorious golden light, shot through the air. Shriek! This blow reduced the remaining distance to 0 in an instant. Also, class ability, Basic Spear Technique, Thrust, X, has evolved to Basic Spear Technique, Thrust, Divine Beginning. Because this attack had come from the spear god himself, it was enough to split an entire continent in half. Suddenly, a strange sensation swept through Soul Jihu as the edge of his reinforced sword chi reached a hard surface.
The same phenomenon happened to the parasite queen. Both felt as if they were alone in a white void, separate from the rest of the world.
Sol Jihu's eyes met the parasite queen's. And at that moment, a myriad of thoughts crossed the parasite queen's mind. What was it that she saw? Was it the twilight of dawn? Or was it the twilight of dusk? She would soon discover the answer. Pook!
The reinforced sword chi cracked through the parasite queen's outer shell.
Crack!
The parasite queen's facial muscles trembled as the tip of the spear moved further forward, reaching even the deepest parts of her interior. All of her bone wings tilted downward. Just before the palms reached his back, Sol Jihu mustered all his remaining mana and twisted his spear with every ounce of strength left in him.
Level 9 Divine Spear, Class Ability, Secret Art, Sword Chi Wave, Explosion. With his hands covered with the blood of his comrades.
Quang!
Rays of golden energy poured out of the parasite queen's body one after another. Kia! A long scream echoed throughout Gloria Eterna. Chapter 486. The moment the parasite queen's scream rang out, Sol Jihu's back also curled halfway. Kahak! Blood spurted out from his mouth, nostrils, and ears.
A strong sense of dizziness swept through his head, perhaps from the severe loss of blood.
His vision blurred and shook.
However, Sol Jihu did not fall. Black Sol Jihu and Rusel's voices continued to ring out in his head. That this was the end, and he was only a single step away.
Moreover, Sol Jihu could not let go of the spear of purity stabbed deep inside the parasite queen's stomach. He felt like everyone who had helped him reach this point was holding his hand. And so, Sol Jihu gripped the spear of purity hard and tilted his head up. As soon as he looked up, he roused his energy again. Quang! Reinforced sword chi detonated again. The parasite queen's scream grew louder. Quang! Sol Jihu did not stop. Kicking off the ground. Quang! And pushing the parasite queen back. Quang! He continued to detonate reinforced sword chi. Quang, 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 quang. As if to settle the score for his fallen comrades. A brilliant light dyed the world white. No sound reverberated. The only thing that could be seen was light, the white light emitted by the parasite queen and the golden light detonated by Sol Jihu. Within the blinding light of glory, Sol Jihu felt something touch the tip of the spear of purity. Then, feeling a terrifying resistance, Sol Jihu squeezed out every last bit of his energy. Although he already used up all of his mana and did not have any left, he forcefully twisted and wrung out the very last vestiges of mana in his circuit and moved into the spear of purity. Quang! It was an attack containing all his might. As he detonated his energy, the counter-elastic force increased. Sol Jihu's feet left the ground, his body floating up. He shook violently like a flag fluttering in a storm. He felt like he was at sea in the middle of a fierce storm. However, Sol Jihu did not let go of his spear. He stood strong and opened his eyes wide. He wanted to confirm the parasite queen's final moments. End. Asterisk. Cough, cough. A cough escaped Sol Jihu's mouth. Opening his eyes, Sol Jihu blinked rapidly. The first thing he saw was a shattered marble flooring. He had fallen to his stomach without even realizing it. A faint pain wrung out in his arms. Looking up, he saw his arms stretched out. The spear of purity was still in his hands. He had not let go of it even until the very end. Where am I? He saw a place that resembled the grand hall of a royal palace. Looking around, Sol Jihu felt a bright light flowing in from the front. His gaze, which slowly went up the spear shaft, stopped at the spear tip. The parasite queen was sitting at the throne. No, it was hard to say that she was sitting. The throne was half broken, and it was more suitable to say that the parasite queen was skewered to the throne by the spear of purity than sitting.
She was half strewn on the throne, looking up at the ceiling with her chin up. As far as Sol Jihu could tell, she looked like someone who was quietly awaiting the moment of her death. This was especially so because of the sparkling light coming out of her body.
No. Sol Jihu quickly got up. He pulled out the spear of purity and began to stab the parasite queen again. Die! He did not dare to be complacent. It wasn't over until the very end.
After all, the enemy he was facing was the parasite queen. If he gave even a little opening, there was a possibility she might revive while shouting, "I'll show you my true self." He had to finish her off when he had the chance.
And so, he stabbed the parasite queen again and again. It was then.
"Why don't you give it a rest?" A feeble voice rang out. Sol Jihu stopped his spear. "You should already know that it is over." It was true. But you can never be too sure. The parasite queen stared fixedly at the nonchalantly retorting Sol Jihu.
There is something I need to tell you before I go.
A final excuse from the loser?
Cheeky until the end, huh? Just listen. It will not be a bad thing for you to know.
Yes, go ahead.
I'll hear you out until you perish. Sol Jihu murmured as he resumed stabbing his spear. You have an incredible talent.
The parasite queen shook her head in disapproval but continued unfazed. To be precise, I should say that you obtained the qualification. Though you might find it hard to believe, you, a mere mortal, have achieved the level of existence to become a god. Of course, you are not the first one in the history of this universe, but what is certain is that you have the potential to achieve a level of existence that is higher than anyone else in this world.
With this battle, I became sure.
You can surpass the 7 sins and even myself. Sol Jihu's spear stopped.
For a moment, a barely visible smile appeared on the parasite queen's face before disappearing. Consume me.
Sol Jihu's eyes widened.
He gulped and scanned the parasite queen's body.
That is not what I mean.
The parasite queen quickly added. I am telling you to consume my divinity.
Sol Jihu tilted his head.
Won't you leave your divinity behind when you die anyway?
That is true, but that is my essence.
Do you think you will be able to fully absorb my divinity just because you achieved your current level of existence? You must have heard how difficult it is to absorb even the 7 virtues' divinity. You must also take your authority of gluttony into consideration. No matter how special you are still a human. But with me around, things might be a little different. When Sol Jihu showed a hint of interest, the parasite queen slowly raised her upper body. Do you not want to achieve an even higher level of existence?
A suggestive voice flowed out.
Do you not want to leave this world and see a broader universe? Looking at Sol Jihu, who was staring in a daze, she lowered her head slightly. All of this can be achieved if you so desire. ... And, if you want. ... I will help you. It was then. The parasite queen abruptly closed her mouth. It was because Sol Jihu raised his hand as if to tell her to stop. This must be it, right, Lady Russell? He murmured to himself before suddenly looking up at the parasite queen. I understand what you're saying, but let me ask you a few questions. Speak. Are you asking me to spare you? You seem to have misunderstood me.
I misunderstood you? How are you going to help me in your current state? If I accept, aren't you going to ask me to help you recover?
For example, like giving you one of the 7 virtues divinities or something.
Sol Jihu murmured.
What are you going to do when your divinity recovers?
Escape?
Hide and look for an opportunity to strike back?
The parasite queen's eyes narrowed.
Ah, and one more thing.
Sol Jihu continued.
Did you make a similar offer to Paradise's chief deity? The parasite queen kept silent.
Sol Jihu waited for an answer before smirking.
Well,
it didn't sound bad.
Perhaps you might have been telling the truth. Then,
still,
even if the parasite queen was being genuine, even if such a future was possible, I don't want to become a pawn to help you exact vengeance on the martial god."
The parasite queen's face stiffened. "How do you know that much?"
A groan escaped her lips. "It's still a hard offer to pass up." "Ah. I'll consider it seriously if you can grant my request."
"To become your concubine?" Sol Jihu laughed. He raised the spear of purity and held it up to the parasite queen's face like a microphone. "You and me." Then, he spoke.
"Let's say it together. I say, Ang. Opening square bracket question mark closing square bracket. And you say, Ang.
Okay.
Opening square bracket closing square bracket. Ang. Opening square bracket closing square bracket. Ang. Sol Jihu pushed the spear further up. The parasite queen closed her eyes. Crazy brat. Sighing deeply, she leaned back down as if she had given up completely. Even at a moment like this. Feeling humiliated, a despondent look appeared on her face.
How infuriating. This is nothing like the ending I had in mind.
Soon, the parasite queen's body began to shine. She could last a little longer if she wanted to, but she knew very well that Sol Jihu had no intention of letting her live. She had chosen to perish rather than be ridiculed any further. Just what did I do to meet someone like you? To think I will meet my end from someone like you? As she despaired, beams of light began to shoot out from her body. Don't think too badly of it. The parasite queen's final moment wasn't ostentatious or splendid. Only tranquil rays of light quietly flowed out. Just that was enough to fill the grand hall with light. It's just that I want to remain a human for now. Sol Jihu placed the spear of purity on his shoulder. All right, then. Sol Jihu raised his hand as he saw the parasite queen scattering away. Goodbye, crybaby. Smiling beamingly, he waved his hand. Son of a bitch. Those were the parasite queen's final words. Qua. As the light detonated, a giant pillar of light soared up. Then, when the pillar that pierced the sky subsided. Whoa! The parasite queen could not be seen any longer. All that was left was an orb that was slightly bigger than the 7 virtues divinities and a larger, clearer essence. They must be the divinities of the chief deity and the goddess of parasitism. Bending down and picking up the 2 divinities, Sol Jihu looked refreshed. The world began to look different. Perhaps he was relieved to finally have everything off his chest. It's over. It felt like it was only yesterday that he ran away from the bugs, cockroaches, and medusas at Arden Valley. It's really over. He had mixed feelings, but the strongest emotion out of them all was a relief from defeating a seemingly undefeatable enemy. After standing still for a moment, Sol Jihu did a double take as he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Looking back, he saw a familiar face. Mr. Hao Win? Yo! Hao Win greeted him playfully. He was in a sorry state. The black sunglasses he always wore were nowhere to be seen, and his gloves were drenched in bodily fluids. It didn't look like he had major injuries, most likely from the World Tree's help, but Sol Jihu could tell at a glance that he went through a fierce battle. Hao Win saw the same thing. After seeing a grand hall filled with light, a broken throne, and 2 orbs held in Sol Jihu's hand. Really? He smiled. Congratulations. My friends. Some were lucky enough to have survived. Hao Win pointed at the group of fireflies that was leaving his body and flying away. Some, unfortunately, died. Sol Jihu sighed. He knew it couldn't be helped, but it still stung a little. This isn't the time to be standing here then. Don't worry too much. Sol Jihu looked at Hao Win with a questioning look. Hao Win took out a transparent crystal from his pocket. It was a communication crystal. We're already taking notes of the casualties. Information about the main unit was the first to get reported. Ah! The dead should have made preparations beforehand on Earth. Miss Foxy also left to take care of Valhalla's members. Sol Jihu breathed a sigh of relief. Our war is over now. Now, it's their war. All you have to do is go back as soon as you can.
Sol Ji-hoo nodded.
Contribution points won't be a problem, but… He felt better after hearing what Hao Win said, but he wasn't entirely relieved.
Having experienced the death penalty, he knew how dangerous it could be. To lessen his comrades' pain, he had to go back as soon as possible.
I understand what you're feeling. I don't plan to stop you either.
Hao Win approached Sol Ji-hoo with a grin. But can't you say a word or two as the hero who killed the parasite queen?
Ha!
Come on, let's go.
Do you have any idea how many people are waiting for you outside? What do you mean? Hao Win dragged Sol Ji-hoo outside. It didn't take long for Sol Ji-hoo to find out. Wah!
A loud cheer erupted when Sol Ji-hoo went outside.
He became dazed as countless fireflies danced in the sky. Underneath the setting sun, the half-destroyed imperial capital ironically gave off a snug feeling. Countless people were crowding together. Paradisians, earthlings, foreign races. Everyone was gathered together, and more people were coming close. He's out. He's out.
Is it true? Did we win?
What happened to the parasite queen?
Is she really dead?
Questions shot out from left and right.
Rather than answering them, Sol Ji-hoo raised his hands and revealed the orbs inside them.
Despite this, the questions continued.
They couldn't be blamed. Many of them had been tormented by the parasites for dozens of years.
The goddess of parasitism was an immortal god that they did not even dare imagine killing. It made sense for them to want to check twice, thrice, and more. The problem was that Sol Ji-hoo wasn't a fan of such atmospheres. It was good to be happy. But the problem was the stares he was getting.
Everyone looked at him with respect and admiration, and they were shouting heatedly as if to expect something.
I need to go back quickly. He didn't feel like he could leave in such an atmosphere.
Hao Win was only shrugging his shoulders behind him. Just as Sol Ji-hoo was scratching his face in embarrassment, he caught sight of someone. Miss Agnes?
Agnes was alive. She was staring at him while leaning on a broken wall in a sorry state. I'm glad.
If Agnes didn't help him up at the very end, the one standing here would not be him but the parasite queen.
When their eyes met, she gave Sol Ji-hoo a gentle smile and shook her head.
But then, she flinched after watching the corner of Sol Ji-hoo's lips curl up. Suddenly getting a bad feeling, she tried to move.
However, Sol Ji-hoo was already facing the crowd.
Yes, it is true. He spoke with a bright smile. The parasite queen has perished. Paradise is no longer under threat. We are all safe. Sol Ji-hoo spoke clearly.
A heaven-shaking roar broke out when Sol Ji-hoo made his announcement.
The crowd was now looking at him fervently like religious zealots.
It's true. It's really true. Hurrah! Hurrah!
Did you really kill a god?
We won. You wah. Just how? They held each other and rejoiced. Still, the questions did not stop.
It was thanks to one powerful spell. Once Sol Ji-hoo spoke with a mana-imbued voice, the cheers subsided a little bit.
Do you want to know what it is?
Sol Ji-hoo said with a beaming smile.
Do you want me to tell you what this spell is? Yes. We do.
Everyone shouted at the same time. Good, then I'll tell you.
Kuum. Sol Ji-hoo cleared his throat and then threw out his arms. Everyone, shout.
Then, he really shouted.
Hurrah! Lilac.
The dazedly staring Agnes' eyes shot open. What? A color? Lilac? The crowd bustled. It seemed too random. What does that mean? It's not hurrah, Sol Ji-hoo. It was then.
Hurrah, lilac.
Someone shouted after Sol Ji-hoo.
Sol Ji-hoo grinned as if to egg on the crowd.
Hurrah, teddy bear.
Another random shout came out of him.
Hurrah, teddy bear.
Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah!
However, more people shouted after him.
It was because of the atmosphere.
Everyone was enjoying the taste of victory after a fierce war. These were also the words coming out of the hero who led them to victory.
In truth, most of them were just shouting to express the emotions pent up inside them. That was how mob psychology worked. Once a few people started shouting it, the rest were swept along.
Hurrah, lilac! Hurrah, teddy bear! Soon, everyone was shouting the same thing, screaming from the top of their lungs and shaking their weapons in excitement.
They didn't know anything about what they were shouting.
Sol Jihu shot his arms up with a look of satisfaction.
Hurrah, evil butt! Hurrah, evil butt! Words of a public execution echoed out in the imperial capital, all the way from the location of the Allied forces' main camp to where the World Tree was located. Ting ting tang tang frying pan butt, hurrah! Ka ha ha!
What a funny spell!
Ting ting tang tang frying pan butt, who?
Quang! A small explosion broke out.
A man who was hitting two weapons against each other in a clamor suddenly fell to the ground, rolling.
After coming to a stop, he rubbed his cheek in tears.
Why? He seemed to be asking why he was hit.
Agnes turned her fuming, red face.
Sol Jihu was gone. He was way off in the distance, running away.
Stop right there. Agnes began to chase him after him.
Stop! Stop, I said.
You better get your ass over here now. Screaming angrily, she pursued him as if her life depended on it.
You're dead. You're so dead. However, she couldn't close the distance in the slightest.
Having regained a little bit of energy thanks to the World Tree, Sol Jihu was getting farther away by the second.
Just wait, till I catch you.
Agnes eventually gave up, her scream echoing out in all directions.
As for Sol Jihu, ah ha ha ha!
He was laughing.
Running fast, he tilted his head, looked up at the sky, and laughed. Tears came out, and he was running out of breath, but his laughter never stopped. A beautiful twilight was cast over the sky. It was more peaceful than ever before. Soon, Sol Jihu's feet left the ground. Soaring up, he glided across the sky and flew at full speed. He headed to Earth, where his comrades would be waiting. Chapter 487.
Sol Jihu did not leave with the Allied force.
He returned home on the same path he took after making fun of Agnes. It was because that was the quickest way he could get back. Of course, he did not forget to make calls on the way back.
A total of 7 Valhalla members had died. Marcel Gionia, Maria, O. Rahi, Kazuki, Phi Sora, Vlad Halep, and Hugo. Chinzia had also died as well. Thank goodness Miss Un Yuri didn't die. If she did, it would have been her second death, and she would not have been able to revive. Her survival surely had something to do with her own abilities. Still, the biggest factor seemed to be that she left the battlefield before the Parasite Queen began to seriously target the main unit.
Of course, if it weren't for the World Tree being there, everyone would have died. They should be okay, right?
A day on Earth was equal to 3 days in paradise.
Sol Jihu hoped they would last at least 2 to 3 days. Although it was tiring to fly at full speed both day and night, Sol Jihu did not slow down in the slightest. He minimized the rest time, ate dried meat for food while flying, and cut down on sleep to continue flying. As a result, he arrived at his destination earlier than everyone expected. A city could be seen in the distance.
Just as Eva was within reach, Sol Jihu's communication crystal blinked.
I just came back from confirming everyone's safety.
It was Kim Hana's voice.
Sol Jihu could see her walking down the temple steps. He had heard she went back to Earth after receiving the report of casualties. It seemed she just got back.
I called everyone, starting with Miss O. Rahi and Miss Phi Sora. Everyone is already at the hospital or being forcefully transferred there. Kim Hana continued. They've all been sedated and restrained. There shouldn't be any problems for a few days. Sol Jihu was relieved. He knew how painful the death penalty could get.
The preparation for the revival has been finished already.
Their acquaintances are watching them 24/7, and we have emergency numbers for each person. Kim Hana continued.
They have entrance slips with them too. Worst case, we force them to rip it.
Obviously, the quicker you come, the better. But I'm telling you this, so you don't have to worry too much. Sol Ji-hoo stared at Kim Hana without saying anything.
It seems she didn't know that he was already here.
Anyway, where are you right now?
Kim Hana.
Sol Ji-hoo's voice sank.
His face turned serious as well.
Listen to me carefully. Huh? Why are you so serious all of a sudden? From now on, don't pick up calls from anyone else unless they are from me. What?
And go back to the warp gate right now.
Don't stay in paradise.
Hurry.
Kim Hana froze.
Her eyes widened. Seeing Sol Ji-hoo's slightly angry expression in the crystal and listening to his urgent voice.
What's going on?
She looked around her surroundings and lowered her voice as well. You need to explain what's going on so I can. The war isn't over yet.
Sol Ji-hoo cut her off. What? I don't have much time, so listen carefully. The real enemy is elsewhere. Hey, are you trying to?
Kim Hana. Sol Ji-hoo raised his voice. Kim Hana flinched. Think about it. The parasite queen is gone.
The biggest threat to paradise is no longer here.
Who do you think is unneeded at this point?
Kim Hana blinked in a daze.
What would happen to Earthlings now that paradise was liberated was indeed a big question.
An Earthling who has the power to threaten a god owns the divinities of the chief deity and the parasite queen. Who do you think is feeling most anxious right now?
Kim Hana gasped. What Sol Ji-hoo was saying made sense.
Don't tell me.
Right. Sol Ji-hoo's lips trembled.
The real mastermind were the 7 sins. After a brief silence, Sol Ji-hoo said,
I don't have time to explain everything in detail.
Just go back to the warp gate.
Oh, okay. Kim Hana turned around.
Then what about you?
I'll explain later when we meet on Earth. Be careful.
It was then. Oh, right. Kim Hana looked back at the communication crystal as if she remembered something.
When are you going to get that bullshit illness treated?
Sol Ji-hoo was taken aback.
What a load of crap. Is this really the time and place to be pulling a prank? And who do you think I am?
Huh?
And no, You know, I just talked with Gyula Nim.
You did?
She asked if we could return the chief deity's divinity and said that she would revive everyone who died in this war and then calculate the contribution points separately. I actually called to tell you this.
Sol Ji-hoo's eyes shot open. Really?
Yes.
Kim Hana shouted. Indeed, now that the parasite queen was dead, the 7 sins would have more leeway in how they used their power since they could divert the effort spent on keeping the parasite queen in check elsewhere. Sol Ji-hoo scratched his head.
Just wanted to make you go back as soon as possible. Sure you were.
Kim Hana clicked her tongue. Was that really the first thing you thought of? When are you going to grow up? Quote. Grow up, will you?
Sol Ji-hoo became sullen at Kim Hana's nagging. Anyway, where are you right now?
Don't try to pull anything funny this time. Sol Ji-hoo was currently flying above the city before he noticed. After locating Gyula's temple, he descended right away.
Here.
Kim Hana's eyes widened as she saw Sol Ji-hoo shooting down like a meteor.
Already.
After landing, Sol Ji-hoo immediately picked Kim Hana in a princess carry and then leapt back up. He went straight to the temple, then threw Kim Hana into the warp gate.
I'll make the wish right away, so go on ahead. I'll be there right behind. Sol Ji-hoo's throwing power was so great that Kim Hana flew straight into the portal. You son of a bitch! Only her curse echoed out. Auntie! Sol Jihu looked back at Gyula's statue.
Can I get one revival burger?
Like you promised beforehand. He took out the chief deity's divinity from his pocket and flicked it up like a coin. The orb hit the statue's head and fell. Crazy brat.
Gyula spoke clearly.
She looked down at the divinity rolling on the ground and continued. So you're offering up this valuable divinity to the hidden mastermind.
Sol Jihu looked away and whistled. Gyula sighed deeply. No matter how childish the man in front of her acted, he was her apostle and the hero who exterminated the parasite queen. Though he lacked any grace and dignity of a legendary hero, she had no choice but to acknowledge his achievements.
I have seen your achievements well. Yes, yes.
There are many things I want to say, but I need to tell you one thing first and foremost.
Well done. You have achieved what no one else. Gyula Nim. Sol Jihu raised his hand.
I get what you're trying to say, but can you get on with the revival first?
I'm a bit worried, so I want to go see them.
He was basically just telling her to skip the formalities and get on with the revival work.
Do what you want.
Gyula shook her head as if she'd given up.
Your wish has been granted.
Thanks, see you later.
Sol Jihu disappeared into the temple right away.
Fufu, he really looks elated, doesn't he?
Luxuria giggled as she watched Sol Jihu diving into the portal.
She smiled like a mother watching her son running around without a worry.
It's to be expected.
Gyula smiled bitterly.
He's finally free of the burden he's shouldered for several years.
You're right.
He looked even happier than we are. He must feel like he's over the moon. Luxuria agreed. Let's leave him be for a while. It's cute. I let it slide today, but he should know there's a limit to my patience. Gyula smacked her lips.
What was that?
Revival burger? If that brat blabbers on about me being an ant or a mastermind again. Gyula gritted her teeth. Asterisk.
That day. That day was finally here.
The day that everyone had been eagerly waiting for.
The day that did not seem possible.
Although the wounds from the long, drawn-out war remained, the seven sins were not so stingy now that the parasite queen was dead. They revived all who died regardless of race.
The Allied forces' main unit held a meeting and returned the favor by offering the divinities of the four virtues they obtained in the final war. The seven sins were elated to hear the news, and they reciprocated by separately calculating contribution points as they did with Sol Jihu. A few days after that, the Earthlings who died began to return.
Each person that walked out of the temple brought about a cheer from their comrades and acquaintances.
The Earthlings who returned by reviving all rejoiced with an awkward smile.
It was only then that they burst into joy. A festival was held where everyone from both the Federation and humanity participated. A morning festival, an afternoon festival, an evening festival, and even a late-night festival. The partying never stopped.
Everyone in paradise ate, drank, and enjoyed day and night as if to make up for what they lacked all these years.
Valhalla was the same.
Every member drank to their heart's content outside, but they immediately started another drinking party after coming together.
Floan was busy playing tag with the baby beastmen, the latter running for their lives screaming. Little Chick cackled while watching them and then elegantly dipped his beak inside a wineglass. Chohong began making bomb cocktails, saying that was how alcohol should be drunk. Oh Rahi took a glass from her, and after gulping it down, collapsed on top of Hugo, who had already fainted. Park Worry and Yu Yolmu were busy making food in the kitchen and ferrying them to the drinking party. Maria voluntarily helped them, as well. Come get your hot dog, Tilda. Delicious hot dog for just 1 silver coin, Tilda.
To be more precise, she was selling food that she didn't even make for an insane price.
Audrey Basiler clicked her tongue, commenting on Maria's lack of conscience. Meanwhile, Teresa had gotten completely drunk and cried while saying she never thought this day would come. With her crying, Charlotte Aria, who was sipping on a cocktail, also teared up.
Eventually, the two embraced each other and bawled their eyes out.
Kazuki drank quietly while leaning on the wall.
Hoshino Urara plastered a bunch of noodles in her armpits and bounced around while calling herself a free bird.
Marcel Guionnet took a bite from a dish Yuri made and collapsed on the spot. He began to foam from his mouth and convulse shortly afterward. Yuri tilted her head and then looked for another victim to be her guinea pig.
Vlad Halep, who was nearby, ran away screaming.
Yi Sol Ah and Ona Halep giggled as they watched this unfold.
Jang Maldong and Sorg Kun also laughed while tapping each other's shoulders.
Everyone enjoyed the party, drinking and chatting merrily. The most excited person, however, was Sol Ji-hoo. "Drink, drink.
When are you going to drink if not today? Aw, why are you crying, princess?"
He went around toasting everyone and then hugged Teresa and spun.
He was so drunk that Seo Yu-hui had to follow him around, worrying whether he would hurt himself.
Of course, her true purpose was separating Sol Ji-hoo from Teresa.
"Don't you think he's been too high-spirited lately?"
Phi Sora spoke while munching on a pizza slice. "The problem is with his pranking tendencies."
Kim Hannah smacked her lips with her arms crossed and with a look of dissatisfaction.
"Well, it's not like I don't understand where he's coming from." Phi Sora shrugged and walked forward.
"Dear?"
Sol Ji-hoo shot back as soon as Phi Sora called out to him. His face was red, and his eyes were loose. "What's up with you today?"
"This isn't like you." "What do you mean, Tilda?" He slurred at the end of his speech, making it obvious that he was drunk.
Phi Sora giggled. "I mean, when we had parties in the past, you always used to leave in the middle.
But you're letting yourself go today."
"Ah, Tilda, well, you know Tilda." Sol Ji-hoo placed his hand on Phi Sora's shoulder. As he brought his face up to hers, the smell of alcohol wafted out.
"Back then, Tilda, it was because I didn't know what was going to happen in the future, Tilda, but now I do, Tilda."
Okay. Good job. You did well." Phi Sora pushed Sol Ji-hoo off and laughed. She then picked up an empty bottle, put a spoon in it backward, and then gave it to Sol Ji-hoo. "Alright, since you're feeling it, why don't you sing?"
"Sing, Tilda? I love singing, Tilda. A party's more fun with music. But look at us, we're just drinking and talking."
"You should do the honors as our representative."
"Right, a party needs music. And I'm still the representative."
Sol Ji-hoo gave a strange smile.
"Still?"
Phi Sora tilted her head but did not put much thought into it. Though she did not know this, she was a little drunk as well. "All right.
As the representative, I will sing my first and last song."
Sol Ji-hoo held up the alcohol bottle microphone and shouted.
The people around him sent his quizzical glances but also clapped and cheered.
"Let's see, Tilda, what should I sing, Tilda?" Sol Ji-hoo giggled and looked around before suddenly stopping. A flushed woman was sitting in the corner of the room, drinking wine with her face red. It was Baek Haiju. Their eyes met. At that moment, Sol Ji-hoo's cheerful gaze suddenly turned somber. He became serious and lowered his head. Then, "I'll sing a song."
After clearing his throat,
"I'm sorry.
Just a small person like me." He suddenly began to sing a ballad.
"I'm sorry. Because of my lingering attachments. I can't let go of you." Phi Sora became flustered. She wanted him to liven up the mood with a pop song, so what happened? "Like a lost child, Tilda, I begged you not to go, Tilda." In any case, Sol Ji-hoo was singing passionately. He was so into it that he even began to tear up. And for some reason, Baek Haiju, who was quietly listening, trembled. Sniff. She even sniffled and then shut her eyes. "Don't close your eyes, Tilda, look at me, please, Tilda." Hearing the lyrics, Baek Haiju forced herself to look back up. Sol Ji-hoo was also looking at her. "Even when I try to whisper into your ears." Sol Ji-hoo was sobbing before anyone realized. "When I'm standing in front of you, I can only shrink back."
Baek Haiju's lips trembled, and her eyes became red.
"I'm just a coward." In the end, Sol Ji-hoo fell on his knees. He began to wail and beg for forgiveness while everyone else was confused. Phi Sora began to sweat as she watched in a daze. However, Sol Ji-hoo wasn't the only one crying. Hick!
A stream of tears also fell down the fixedly staring Baek Haiju's face. "You bastard! Why didn't you come to your senses earlier? You were the only one I cared about. Do you know how much you hurt me and made me cry?"
She trailed off and burst into tears. "Yu Wong." She tilted her head up and cried loudly. "Wish a wind blew." The party's atmosphere had turned cold before anyone noticed. By this point, Phi Sora had stopped thinking. What's up with the two of them? Blaming herself for making Sol Ji-hoo sing, she slumped down. "I don't know." "Don't ask me." Kim Hana also dropped her head. Chapter 488. Both sides had staked everything on this final war. It was a fierce war, one that resulted in numerous casualties. The blood spilled was enough to form a lake, but in the end, Sol Ji-hoo's spear prevailed and pierced the parasite queen. And the Federation and humanity triumphed over the parasites. The threat of the parasites, which lasted more than 2 decades, a period long enough for a newborn baby to grow into an adult, was finally gone forever. Those liberated from years of intimidation and fear enjoyed their newly regained freedom. The festival, which took place after the resurrection of the deceased, lasted more than 14 days. But now that excitement was beginning to fade. Popping champagnes was fun, but they still had a lot left to do. The long war left deep scars on both the Federation and humanity. In addition to healing the wounded, it was time for all the races to get together to discuss how things would proceed from here on. They also had to decide what to do with the vast imperial territory that had just lost its owner. Their agenda also included discussions on what would happen to the Earthlings in the future. There's a saying that the enemy of one's enemy is one's friend. But that mutual enemy was now gone. Everyone worked together during the war, but it was simply foolish to expect them to maintain the same friendly relationship forever. Not only was the future an unknown territory, but also some races had never been on good terms with each other from the beginning. One example of such a case was the Sky Fairies and the Cave Fairies, who only joined hands with each other because they had no other choice. Fortunately, at this point, no one had enough resources left to pursue another war. When the historic first meeting was held, the heads of all races agreed that their first and foremost aim should be to help each other recover from the wounds of war. But this hardly meant that the rest was smooth sailing. Because each race craved something different, they often faced conflicts of interest. The situation became especially tense when the Sky Fairies claimed that the Cave Fairies should return their spirits as promised, now that the war was over. Soon, it became apparent that a mediator was needed to help two opposing parties reach a negotiated resolution. This mediator would have to meet 2 conditions. First, they had to be strong enough to control numerous groups, and second, they had to be qualified to act as a mediator. There was only one person in the entire paradise who met both conditions. He united humanity, sought peace with the Federation, and played the greatest role in defeating the parasites. In short, Sol Ji-hoo. His influence in paradise was greater now than ever before and even surpassed that of the 7 sins. It was nothing to be surprised about. Many had viewed him as the representative of humanity even before the war. His biggest achievement in the war, the extermination of the parasite queen, only served to strengthen the foundation that had already been laid. Sol Ji-hoo quickly emerged as the most influential person in paradise. And when the news spread that he surrendered the divinity of the chief deity to resurrect the victims of the war, many began to praise him not only as a war hero but also as a benevolent saint. As proof of his popularity, he was showered with gifts from various organizations.
though Kim Hana saw them merely as acts of flattery.
Anyhow, when Sol Ji-hoo volunteered to become the mediator, some of the members of Valhalla could not hide their worry.
They knew that, despite the fancy titles, Sol Ji-hoo was a prankster who loved to pull tricks on people. But their fears were soon found to be unnecessary.
Sol Ji-hoo excelled as a mediator,
just as he did in the past when he returned from the path of the soul.
He presented 2 rules in relation to the mediation.
First, he would return everything, be it land or rights, to their rightful owners. Second, he would put a priority on restoring the war damage as agreed upon. His opinion was that the damaged cities should be restored first before cultivating the newly acquired territory.
Everyone agreed. Although the central area had already been purified, it would take some time for the blessing of the World Tree to reach the remote corners of the empire anyway. Of course, not all issues could be resolved through his rules. In those cases, Sol Ji-hoo gave the involved parties a chance to make the final decision. For example, regarding the issue between the sky and the cave fairies, Sol Ji-hoo told them, "I, personally, would like to give the cave fairies another chance. If both of you agree, I'd be happy to speak to the 2 spirit lords." The cave fairies were content that Sol Ji-hoo had sided with them, and the sky fairies were content that the mediator did not force his ideas on them and respected formal procedures. Many hectic days followed.
During this period, Sol Ji-hoo was so busy that he found himself wishing for a clone. Nevertheless, he remembered to repay those who helped him unconditionally during difficult times. The triads became a representative organization of a city, as Hao Win had hoped.
Although Newer had been completely devastated by the parasite's attack, Sol Ji-hoo promised Hao Win a speedy restoration. Sol Ji-hoo also remembered to reward the Yi siblings. Unfortunately, there were no more elixirs left in the spirit realm, according to the sky fairies.
But this was not a problem.
Sol Ji-hoo took the siblings to the temple and made a wish.
Then he spent contribution points to bring the elixir to Earth and handed it over to the siblings. A smile of satisfaction spread over Sol Ji-hoo's face as he watched the siblings shed tears of joy in the arms of their now healthy mother, though it did take him by surprise when she asked if he was Yi Sol-ah's boyfriend.
There was more.
The 7 sins resurrected only those who had passed away during the final war, but Sol Ji-hoo's helping hand reached even further. He resurrected Dylan and Ian, then went with Jang Maldong to visit them in Hawaii and handed over the invitations. He also helped Marika Larissa, Marcel Guianea's fiancée, and Ace Yui, Kazuki's little sister. When Kim Hana told Sol Ji-hoo that he was being way too generous, he answered, "I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but for now, I think this will be the last thing I do for them."
Everything was coming to an end. This would be the last time he'd work for Paradise.
Time passed by, and finally, he was rewarded with a small compensation.
Asterisk.
Sol Ji-hoo sat in his chair in his office and picked up a paper from his desk. This was the fruit of all his hard work. A peace treaty signed by the heads of all races promising to cooperate for the next 50 years to restore and revitalize Paradise.
Sol Ji-hoo conveniently named it the Half-Century Treaty. Others practically begged him to choose a different name, but Sol Ji-hoo refused. He believed that no other name would be more appropriate. "Well, I do like that the Federation isn't dissolving right away." Kim Hana nodded at the paper before suddenly letting out a chuckle.
"What you said at the very end was especially remarkable." "What did I say? You don't remember?" Kim Hana cleared her throat. "I will treat anyone who violates the terms set forth in this treaty for the next 50 years as the next parasites, no matter who they are or what their reasons might be." Kim Hana did her best impression of Sol Ji-hoo, trying to sound serious. Sol Ji-hoo smiled bitterly. "Congratulations. You took care of everything that needs to be taken care of. You know, I feel like the past few weeks may have been more intense than the war itself." Sol Ji-hoo placed the treaty back down on the desk and stretched his shoulders. A groan slipped out of his mouth.
You did well. From here on out. Kim Hana's eyes sparkled with hope as she looked at Sol Ji-hoo.
She could see the future of a young man, who, as the greatest hero in the history of paradise, would enjoy absolute and untouchable authority, freedom, and fame.
It was then that Sol Ji-hoo spoke. I'm going back to Earth tomorrow, early in the morning.
Kim Hana's eyes widened.
That's up to you, but
why so suddenly?
I got a call from the temple. I figured I might as well visit home since I've got some business to take care of on Earth anyway.
Sol Ji-hoo did not elaborate on what the business was.
Kim Hana. Suddenly, he lowered his voice. Does this count as keeping my promise?
You know, the promise I made to you back at the inn, where we slept on the same bed. Kim Hana's eyes quickly narrowed.
Will you stop phrasing it weirdly?
She rolled her eyes at Sol Ji-hoo before giving a nod.
Well, yes. Sol Ji-hoo did keep his promise.
He gave her considerable authority over Valhalla. He became a big tree that easily looked down on Sinyoung, and he never betrayed her. Seems like it was just yesterday. Kim Hana smiled, recalling the time when Sol Ji-hoo suddenly announced to her that he would create an organization. Sol Ji-hoo, too, smiled softly.
Hey!
However, solemnity soon replaced his smile.
I want you to gather everyone together before I leave tomorrow. No absences allowed. Everyone has to be there.
What? You mean, like a meeting?
A meeting sounds way too formal. I just have something I want to tell everyone.
Sol Ji-hoo smiled again.
A look of suspicion crossed Kim Hana's face. She could tell that he was downplaying the situation. Whatever it was that he was going to say, tomorrow would be a big announcement for all. I know you too well to fall for that tone.
But at the same time, she couldn't help but doubt whether this was another one of his famous practical jokes. There had been simply too many precedents. I'm a bit tired, so I'm going to bed now.
I'll see you tomorrow. Sol Ji-hoo rose from his chair and made his way to the door. Representative. Kim Hana stretched out her arm to grab him.
But when she saw Sol Ji-hoo walk down the hallway, she brought her arm back down to her side.
For some reason, she felt like she shouldn't stop him.
Kim Hana stood dazedly for a moment before turning her head. Could it be?
She stared at Sol Ji-hoo's empty chair in silence.
Meanwhile, Sol Ji-hoo puffed his cheeks and then let out a long breath as he descended the stairs.
It's finally tomorrow. Tomorrow was the day he had been waiting for. He felt both relieved and sad at the same time.
With a heart full of mixed feelings, Sol Ji-hoo began making preparations to go to bed. The steps were simple, really.
First, he wandered around the building until he found Seo Yu-hui, who had just finished bathing in the hot spring. Then he rushed at her with all his might.
Ha! Seo Yu-hui flinched in surprise, but her reaction did nothing to deter Sol Ji-hoo from lifting her off her feet and carrying her to his room.
He laid Seo Yu-hui down on his bed and then settled down next to her. His face snuggled into her right, and his hand found its way over to her left. Finally, he placed one leg diagonally over the area between her pelvis and her thigh. Now he was ready to sleep.
Again?
Seo Yu-hui gave a puzzled smile and pinched Sol Ji-hoo's cheek lightly. Yu-hui. Sol Ji-hoo, who had been rubbing his face against her skin, suddenly raised his head.
Yes?
I have something I want to tell you.
Sensing the gravity in his tone, Seo Yu-hui raised her head slightly and brought her face closer to his. What is it?
The truth is.
The next day, Sol Ji-hoo set out early in the morning as planned. As he walked out of Valhalla's building, memories of the times he had spent here began to race through his mind.
That first day when he took everyone to the auction house. The first time he met Charlotte Aria. When Little Chick hatched from its egg, when they all sat around in a circle to discuss what their name should be, when they got drunk and partied all night long. The memories continued to flood in. If Harem was where Sol Jihu began his life in paradise, Eva was where he finished it. Leaving it all behind, Sol Jihu headed for the temple with a carefree gait and smile. The reason Gyula summoned him was to give notice. We finally reached a conclusion. We decided to reincarnate rather than resurrect the chief deity. We'll start all over again from the beginning. However, in order for us to do so, the 7 virtues will have to be resurrected first. The bottom line was that they would resurrect the 7 virtues as they were but raise the chief deity from birth. I'm sure you understand why we came to this conclusion. Gyula read Sol Jihu's mind and continued. We'd always known that someday the goddess of parasitism would invade this planet. We knew, so the chief deity must surely have known, too. He assured us that there was nothing to be afraid of. But in the end, we couldn't avoid the future that we always feared. Because the chief deity could not overcome the parasite queen's temptation. Blinded by greed for promotion, the chief deity helped restore the parasite queen's power. When we confronted him on this matter, he only told us, "This much is okay." Not long after that, we noticed that the number of parasites was increasing rapidly. It was a mistake on the chief deity's part. His overconfidence prevented him from realizing just how big a difference 1 rank was. Or, maybe he knew but chose to ignore it out of greed. Of course, we saw that future, too. All we could do then was prepare for what might happen behind the chief deity's back. The atmosphere was grave, but Sol Jihu listened with a lightness in his heart. This was only a story of the past and had nothing to do with the future. What's going to happen to the Earthlings now? What everyone is concerned about will not happen. Gyula answered simply. We've decided to maintain the status quo for the time being. Because another tragedy may befall us in the future. Also, we believe that the Earthlings are vital to the reconstruction and prosperity of paradise. Just like how the world needs not only the 7 sins but also the 7 virtues. This was all he needed to hear. Will there be any neutral zones in the future? We may decide to open one from time to time, but no, there won't be any regular occurrences. Sol Jihu nodded. I understand. Are you okay? Gyula asked. I mean, do you regret your decision at all? No. Sol Jihu answered without hesitation. The truth is, I'm a little tired. He continued with a small smile. So I've decided that from now on, I'm going to enjoy my life for myself. That's not a bad idea, but… Gyula continued. What I meant was, do you not want to become a level 10? Sol Jihu's eyes widened. Soon, one of his eyebrows rose slightly. I think I'd better not. How come? To stay human? Yes, and also, I'm a little nervous. Sol Jihu licked his lips. If I do become a level 10, what's my class name gonna be? Well, don't tell me it's gonna be something like, Monogod. Opening square bracket ellipsis dot closing square bracket. Gyula fell silent. I'll just stop here, at level 9 Divine Spear. Sol Jihu clicked his tongue as if he had expected the goddess' response. If I really end up becoming Monogod, I might turn to the dark side and become the next parasite queen, so please understand. He stressed. Okay. Gyula, who indeed was thinking, Golden Monogod, muttered in a dejected voice. Anyway, about what you told others today. She quickly changed the subject, lifting her voice up a notch. You. Gyula read Sol Jihu's mind. Have very little intention of coming back. She sounded disappointed. Little doesn't mean zero. Sol Jihu didn't deny it. But you're right. It probably won't happen. He had already paved the way for various races in paradise to cooperate with each other. From now on, there wouldn't be any reason for Sol Jihu to interfere with the affairs of paradise unless another calamity struck. Unless, for example, another alien species attempted to invade paradise. Well then, I should get going now. Sol Jihu bowed to Gyula.
But just as he was about to set foot on the pathway leading to the warp gate, preparing in advance, Sol Jihu stopped, recalling what Gyula had said in his head.
Gyula Nim. He turned back around and looked at Gyula.
Can I ask you 3 questions?
You may. You said you started preparing for the future early. Was that before we came to paradise or after?
Before. Before. Sol Jihu repeated inside his head and continued.
Can you and other 7 sins visit Earth? Yes, as long as we receive permission.
Then, Sol Jihu glanced quickly at Gyula's statue. Have you ever been to Earth?
No, I have not.
Though initially confused, Sol Jihu quickly regained his composure.
It made sense.
Gyula had no reason to lie to him, and he himself didn't think Gyula was the woman in his memory.
He remembered that the woman he met at the zoo when he was little was soft. But Gyula, when he became the apostle of gluttony, and she hugged him, she was warm but kind of flat.
What did you say? Suddenly, Gyula's enraged voice echoed inside Sol Jihu's head.
How insolent.
But it's true.
You. Flash.
White lightning fell from the ceiling. But Sol Jihu dodged it with ease. Come on, don't be mad.
You.
Sol Jihu hopped like a rabbit to dodge the lightning and sometimes summoned lightning of his own to protect himself as he dashed toward the warp gate. Thanks for the fun.
With his back turned to the goddess, Sol Jihu waved his hand and jumped into the portal. See ya.
Come back here at once. Gyula's voice reached him a beat too late.
I'll punish you the second you return.
The goddess clenched her teeth and swallowed her anger.
Luxuria, who had been watching them in secret, quietly giggled to herself. Chapter 489. Several months passed since the treaty was signed.
Paradise was enjoying a well-deserved peace. The Federation and humanity were heading toward a better future without any big incidents or quarrels.
Well, there was one incident. It was a rather big one that raised quite a bit of commotion in Paradise. It was Sol Jihu retiring from Valhalla. He did not retire from Paradise. Not long after the half-century treaty was signed, Sol Jihu resigned as Valhalla's representative and left the organization. Valhalla's representative. In Paradise, it was a position that held more power than the 6 kingdoms and exerted more influence than the 7 sins. Since he stepped down from such a position on his own, it was only natural for all sorts of rumors to spread. Some said that Sol Jihu was tired of Paradise and would retire. Others suggested that Sol Jihu would found a new organization to lead the unification of Paradise. However, the reality was different from everyone's expectations. Sol Jihu made a home in the corner of Eva's alleyways, in a form that no one expected. A constant stream of foreign races visited Eva as always. As the city served as a bridge connecting the Federation and humanity, it was flourishing and thriving by the day. Eva feels a little different than Harem. One man looked around the streets while walking. He was a tall, black man who could easily be playing for the NBA. It's to be expected. An old man walking next to him responded. He was slender and short, drawing a stark contrast from the first man. Eva is the only city that was unscathed from the destruction of the final war. The old man spoke as he stroked his long, white beard. It is also the city that accepted the Federation the earliest, and the entire city was blessed with fortification. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the capital of humanity is no longer Scheherazade, but Eva. It isn't as if I haven't heard this before, but I have to admit, it feels rather strange. Ha. I'm no different. But that's just how the world works. You might go to sleep one night and wake up to a completely different world. I'm sure we aren't the only ones who feel this way. The old man laughed. Right, the 2 men were none other than Edward Dillon and Ian Denzel. They had revived thanks to Sol Jihu, regained their memories,
and were now actively participating in the revitalization of paradise.
They had come to Eva today to visit a certain person. All right, that's enough chit-chat. Let's hurry.
Didn't we come to see Eva's specialty?
Huh? No,
It's a chilly day, let's hurry. If we're late by a minute, we're going to have to wait for 20 minutes more.
Ian hastened his steps, pushed forward by the blowing cold wind.
Dylan tilted his head as he followed after Ian's fluttering gown. This is the place.
Soon, Ian stopped.
We have to stand behind them. This must be the line.
Dylan blinked. A long line of people was stretched out from an alleyway all the way to the main street.
It was nothing like seeing a bus stop at rush hour. A massive crowd of people was lined up like the crowd that gathers at the airport during the holiday season.
I know what you want to ask,
Ian quietly said.
You want to ask whether
Eva's specialty is so good that it's worth waiting for in such long lines? Dylan subconsciously nodded his head. Then, I will answer without a moment of hesitation.
Ian grinned. Yes.
Still, this line is a little too long.
It can't be helped.
That's how popular this place is.
Education, friendship, and blood relation.
The royal administrator of Eva, who doesn't care about any of these, personally advertised this place as Eva's specialty product. There must be a reason it was given such a title. Well, if I wait in the cold for several hours, I'm confident I can eat anything as if it's the best food in the world.
Haha, but things aren't so bad now. Before, you couldn't eat even after waiting in line for 4 hours.
It was that bad?
People refused to get up once they sat down. So now there is a limit of 2 bowls per person, and they have to leave after 45 minutes from sitting down. 45 minutes. That's pretty tight.
Dylan shook his head.
Well, you'll change your mind once you take a bite. At that moment, Dylan saw a couple walking out of the restaurant.
Wow, that was amazing. See?
At first, I thought it was famous only because of the master's name, but…
Seeing the merrily chatting couple, Dylan made a flustered expression.
He recalled getting in line not too long ago, but there were already dozens of people standing in line behind him.
The couple that just left the restaurant also got back in the line.
They were all eagerly waiting for their turn. I guess I have nothing to lose by giving it a try. Dylan shrugged. Just like Ian said, the line moved quickly. Still, he had to wait 2 hours until they could get in. When he entered the alleyway after turning the corner, a new hell opened up. It was so bad that he felt liberated when he entered the small, shabby restaurant with only 7 or so tables inside. Phew, finally.
What was the name of this place again? I saw the sign but didn't get a chance to read it.
Dylan asked while rubbing his flushed palms. It's Seoul Jihu Ramen? With the question mark included.
Apparently, in Korean, ramen is a shortened way of saying, what if it was? So the name is a play on the actual word, ramen, and that shortened question.
Ian laughed, commenting on the name's wittiness. Ah, okay.
Dylan replied awkwardly. After waiting just a little longer, a party that was sitting at the table in front of the kitchen stood up.
There's an open table. Just as Dylan began to walk forward to sit down. We're here. A 3-person group, led by a red-haired woman, cut in front of them. Dylan was about to raise a complaint before seeing a familiar face and holding himself back. Daddy Tilda. Eun Yuri looked for her daddy the moment she walked in. Hey! We're here. Aren't you gonna say hi? Cho Hong spoke audaciously while laughing.
Judging by the angry protest in the background, they seemed to have ignored the line and walked in.
Ah, welcome. A woman dressed as a waitress carefully walked up.
The trio shut their mouths after taking a look at the rose-gold-haired woman walking over while patting her stomach.
The problem was that her stomach was protruding out.
What?
Cho Hong blinked rapidly. Ah! I'm due soon. Teresa blushed bashfully. Hold on just one moment.
I'll clean the table for you.
My darling told me to rest. but I wanted to move around." She smiled and then wiped the table off with a cloth. Yuri looked at her fixedly before flying forward.
Then, she pressed down on Teresa's stomach.
Ah! A large pillow fell out of Teresa's top. A silence filled the atmosphere for a moment. Chet! Teresa clicked her tongue as if it was ashamed before quickly cleaning up the table and disappearing.
"That woman's starting to lose it."
Cho-hong spoke dumbfoundedly before walking up to the chair.
"Anyway, we're gonna sit here."
"Sorry, Dylan, an old man.
However, she stopped before she sat down.
It was because a finger pointed at the three of them and then at the door.
"The line." A clear voice came out. "Ah! Hey, the line's too long."
"Nope. You have to get in line like everyone else."
Cho-hong's protest didn't do anything.
"Aren't you being too harsh, dear? Aren't we all comrades? Former comrades."
"Am I still Valhalla's representative?"
Phi Sora's protest did not work either. "Daddy."
"Why am I your daddy, Miss Yuri?"
Yuri's attempt to gain sympathy was futile as well. All customers are the same. Not even the 7 sins are an exception. A resolved reply came out. Then what about them?" Phi Sora pointed to the corner of the restaurant. 2 women were busily eating ramen at a table. There should be a limit of 2 bowls per person, but more than 10 bowls were stacked on top of each other on their table. "You'll know if you look at the wall."
Just like the head chef said, a piece of paper was hanging on the wall.
The notice said the following.
"I, Sol Jihu, for committing a grave sin to Claire Agnes in front of everyone, will allow Claire Agnes and one companion of her choice to enter the restaurant without a wait, and until I am forgiven, Claire Agnes and her companion of choice will get unlimited meals at the restaurant."
Miss Agnes is an exception because of my wrongdoing. Phi Sora shut her mouth. What Sol Jihu did that day was indeed out of line. She heard that even Hoshino Urara, who was there at the time, cackled and called him a madman. "You guys are holding up the line." Tap, 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 tap.
The head chef placed the spear of purity, with which he was cutting green onions, on his shoulder.
"Do you want to leave quietly and wait? Or do you prefer to be guided out forcefully?" Although Sol Jihu stepped down from his former position, his abilities did not go anywhere. As formidable energy began to flow out, the trio lowered their tails. "Okay." Phi Sora, Cho-hong, and Yuri turned around dejectedly. "Agnes, do you want to know something?"
Watching the trio trudge away, Chinzia had a proud expression.
"Lately, I've been very proud to have you as my subordinate. If it is because of this restaurant, then I will have to agree."
Agnes replied proudly as well. "Don't forgive him, ever."
"Of course." The duo laughed among themselves before digging into another bowl. Once the trio that cut in line left, Dylan could finally see the head chef's face. "Welcome. Take a seat right here." Sol Jihu greeted them with a bright smile, wearing a white chef's uniform and a white bandana. He wasn't alone either. There were 2 women next to him wearing the same outfit. They were Baek Haiju and Seo Yuhui. "Sorry for the long wait. Come warm yourselves up a little." Teresa came back out in a waitress uniform and put down 2 teacups on the table. "Great, great. I'll go with the Sol Jihu ramen."
"Just the ramen? Or do you want the special? Do you even need to ask?"
"Of course, I want the special."
I'll take the same thing." Dylan raised his hand meekly. Sol Jihu smiled.
2 Sol Jihu ramen specials."
Then, the 2 women next to him hummed, 2 Sol Jihu ramen specials tilde.
"Long time no see, you two. This is the first time you're coming to my restaurant, right, Dylan?" "Old man keeps talking about it. The wait was a killer."
Dylan replied casually, making a subtle jab at Ian.
"Foo-foo. I can't wait to see your shocked face." Ian retorted and then took out a thick book.
"How's Harem doing?"
Sol Jihu asked while pouring water into a pot.
"Not much different."
Well, it's much more relaxed than before.
It would have been good if Dylan joined Valhalla too. The new representative did come to see me a few times. Kim Hannah did?
Yep. I would be lying if I said I didn't consider it.
But I like the way things are now.
No problem.
Doing what you want is best.
Sol Ji-hoo moved busily while chatting with Dylan. Then, the conversation halted. Only the sound of Ian moving his pen was heard.
Seeing Sol Ji-hoo, who was moving and making ramen with great fluidity. Sol. Dylan suddenly said.
I recently discovered a ruin.
Sol Ji-hoo glanced at Dylan. Master Ian also confirmed its existence.
Since it's in uncharted territory, it will be fun exploring it. Dylan continued. I came to ask if you were interested.
Dylan crossed his arms.
But it looks like you're already having fun.
A smile emerged on Sol Ji-hoo's face. After I killed the parasite queen.
I felt kind of empty.
Sol Ji-hoo said.
I didn't know what to do since I no longer had a goal. It was like I burned myself out. Looking at a stopwatch, he put the noodles in as soon as the alarm rang. I actually thought about retiring, but… Cracking open an egg, he continued. When I thought about it more, I realized there was still a lot that had to be done. Ian raised his head and looked at Sol Ji-hoo.
Not things that I have to do, but things that I want to do.
Things I want to do. Ian murmured to himself before moving his pen again. Dylan. Sol Ji-hoo looked up and stared at Dylan.
This is how I live nowadays. Quote.
It's fun.
I enjoy it, and I'm happy.
Seo Yu-hui turned to the side and smiled bashfully while looking at Sol Ji-hoo.
Baek Haiju also revealed a faint smile while preparing the ingredients.
Yeah, I can tell.
Dylan smiled as well. Then it looks like your story ends here.
Talk. Ian put a period and spoke cheerfully.
You're still writing that novel?
Of course. I actually thought today would be the last chapter.
Looks like I was right. Ian closed the book.
I'm thinking about ending the main story here and moving on to side stories. Oh, that sounds good. Sol Ji-hoo laughed and put out a tray with both hands. Here's your order. Ooh, do you have any idea how long I've waited for this moment? Ian rubbed his chopsticks together in joy. And after smelling the spicy aroma that wafted out with the rising steam, Dylan's nostrils also flared up. Slurp. Then, the moment he took a bite. Quote. He jolted. What happened next was the same for Ian and Dylan. Slurp, slurp. The duo slurped up the noodles in the blink of an eye, eating kimchi with their left hand, licking their fingers, and eating rice with the leftover soup. Gulp, gulp. Finally, they gulped down the remaining soup from the bowl. Paha! Kaha! Tang! Dylan and Ian heaved out a gasp after putting down their bowls. Then, they simultaneously shouted. Another Sol Ji-hoo ramen special, please. Yes, Sir Tilda. 2 Sol Ji-hoo ramen specials coming right up. Sol Ji-hoo replied cheerfully. 2 Sol Ji-hoo ramen specials coming right up Tilda. Baek Haiju and Seo Yu-hui also shouted back with cheerful expressions. Asterisk. Time flew, and the afternoon arrived. Sol Ji-hoo ramen? Closed when the sun set. Except for the customers already eating, other customers were sent back with an apology. Only then did the restaurant become quiet. Udadada Tilda. We're done with another fruitful day. Sol Ji-hoo stretched. Then, he felt someone poking him on his side. What's up? Seo Yu-hui hushed him with a finger on her lips. Then, she pointed at a table in the corner of the restaurant. There, a hooded person was eating his ramen. Ha! Ha! Pulling back the long hair that peeked out of the hood, the customer ate busily with delicate lips. Although a baggy robe covered her body, her bulging breasts and delicate fingers made it obvious that she was a woman. Of course, Sol Ji-hoo felt like he knew who she was. Although he had never seen her before, he could feel a strong aura of lust coming from her.
The satisfied moan that escaped her mouth after she finished the soup was also exceptionally sensual.
Sol Ji-hoo smiled and stared at the woman.
Did she feel his gaze?
The woman did a double take, fumbled around a bit, and then stood up. "Thank you for the meal. I'll leave the money here." Nuna.
Hearing Sol Ji-hoo's call, the hurriedly leaving woman stopped. "Come by often."
"And later, we can again go to the zoo together." The woman slowly turned around.
As if she was caught red-handed, an embarrassed smile appeared on her lips.
"Are you asking me out on a date?" No. Okay.
See you again next time."
The woman suddenly jumped in fright and then ran off.
Sol Ji-hoo tilted his head and looked back. Baek Haiju was grinding her kitchen knife, and Seo Yu-hui was cracking her neck with her hands locked together.
"You too."
"Oh, right." Baek Haiju cut him off with a bright smile. "You didn't forget your dinner appointment with the family, right?"
"Of course not." It looked like she was trying to change the subject, but Sol Ji-hoo nodded his head. After cleaning the restaurant and closing the door, the three of them walked to the warp gate side by side. Before stepping into the portal, Seo Yu-hui looked at Sol Ji-hoo and winked.
Sol Ji-hoo also winked in return.
Earth was having winter as well. Sol Ji-hoo put on warm clothes and left his apartment room to head home. In the past, he would feel nervous and anxious when he thought about going back. Even after he went inside, he would stay timid and walk on eggshells around his family.
But that was no longer the case. Visiting and calling them frequently, his relationship with his family was slowly returning to the way it was in the past. Hopping in the SUV that Kim Hana gifted him, he hummed in joy as he started the engine.
Home was just as warm as always.
Sol Ji-hoo walked in with his hands full and sat around the dinner table with everyone to join a hearty meal. Sol Ji-hoo's father barely touched the food. Sitting silently in his seat.
He was in awe at the gift Sol Ji-hoo brought.
"It's the first time I'm seeing this brand."
"It should be.
It's not sold in Korea, so you can only get it in Europe or other foreign countries."
What Sol Ji-hoo brought was cognac.
It was the perfect gift for his father, who had a hobby of collecting foreign liquor.
"With what money?" "I got it when I was on my recent overseas business trip. It wasn't that expensive because I got it from a duty-free shop."
"Oh ho." His father nodded his head. Judging by the way the corner of his lips was curled up, he must be satisfied without a doubt.
"Anyway, I'm glad you found a new workplace."
Sol Woo-sok cut in while munching on food.
"It sounded like an amazing place to work. How did you get into a company like that?" "It wasn't by coincidence. Just connections. A former Sinyoung employee founded the company, and he hit me up."
Sol Ji-hoo smiled vaguely.
The company indeed offered amazing benefits and conditions.
That was only natural since Kim Hana founded the company separately from Valhalla.
She put Jang Maldong as its chairman to make it seem more legitimate, and Sol Ji-hoo was given a believable role as well. "I'm suspicious."
Sol Jin-hee observed Sol Ji-hoo while fiddling around with her chopsticks. "How do we know he's not lying?"
"Why would this person treat Oppa so well?"
"The chairman likes me a lot."
"Though that doesn't begin to describe it."
Sol Ji-hoo chuckled. "I'm not lying. You can come to see me at work if you want. Bring your friends too." With Sol Ji-hoo going so far, Sol Jin-hee had no choice but to back down. "Thanks for the meal."
Finishing her bowl of rice, she shot up.
Their mother frowned as she saw Sol Jin-hee run up the stairs.
"Jin-hee. Aw.
I told you I have to be somewhere today."
"I'm going to be late for the movies. I have already delayed the meeting time for 2 hours."
The door closed shut, followed by an angry shout. "You know that the SATs ended yesterday, right?"
Sol Woo-sok whispered from the side. Her boyfriend took the SATs yesterday, you see.
Huh? She's dating a high schooler? Sol Ji-hoo was startled.
No, I think he just took a gap year. I'm not sure of the specifics, but she broke up with her ex about a month ago and has a new boyfriend now. Wow, she's popular, huh? They must have hit it off on their first date. Anyway, try to understand.
They've been planning this date for a while, it seems. Sol Ji-hoo shrugged. After finishing the meal and having a light chat, Sol Ji-hoo walked up the stairs.
Talk.
After knocking on the door and opening it, he could see Sol Jin-hee, dressed up pretty and applying her makeup.
What? Sol Jin-hee asked curtly after glancing sideways. Do you have time? Make it quick. I have to go see my boyfriend. I have a gift for you.
A gift?
It's not like it's my birthday or anything.
Despite saying this, Sol Jin-hee's eyes were already fixated on the shopping bag Sol Ji-hoo brought.
You can leave it there. Also,
Sol Ji-hoo also put down a white envelope.
Here's some allowance. I heard your boyfriend took the SATs yesterday.
Tell him, good job, and treat him to some good food. Sol Ji-hoo waved his hand and turned back. After pretending to walk down, he went back up silently and peeked into Sol Jin-hee's room.
Sol Jin-hee was busy doing her makeup with one hand and opening the gift with the other. I feel like she'd be a perfect match with Kim Hana.
Sol Ji-hoo couldn't hide his shock at her dexterity, which neared the level of a god.
Let's see. 300,000 won, that's a good amount. The wallet's cute.
Fuck, a condom?
He's a virgin who only just mustered up the courage to hold my hand.
Sonhwa Uni's the problem.
Sol Jin-hee shook her head before shouting abruptly. Ah!
A music box.
They only sell this in Japan. Sol Ji-hoo clenched his fist. He had planned the gift knowing that Sol Jin-hee liked anime and manga.
Hee hee. I knew I was good.
He rubbed his nose and turned back.
This is perfect. He was down because he didn't think he did that well on the SATs.
Maybe this will brighten him up a little.
Sol Ji-hoo staggered on his way down.
Well, I guess it's okay if she's happy.
He walked down to the living room with a bitter smile.
Then I'll be off.
Huh? You're leaving already?
I have somewhere to go to. Where? Sol Woo-sok turned and faced Yu Sonhwa. Like a lost child Tilda.
Yu Sonhwa had suddenly begun to sing. Sol Ji-hoo coughed harshly.
Ah, all right.
Take this.
Sol Woo-sok gave him a bottle of pills.
They're pills to help you sober up. Why, though?
Mother consulted a famous fortune teller regarding you.
She said you should be careful when drinking for the next 3 years and that you'd have a women problem if you didn't.
Have this with you just in case. I'm okay. Is this your company's product? Our company chairman developed it himself.
Apparently, it has immediate effects.
I brought a few as samples.
Oh, the guy with the 2-syllable last name?
Sol Ji-hoo took the bottle. Even if I cry and beg you not to go Tilda.
Meanwhile, Yu Sonhwa's singing continued. Uni, why are you singing all of a sudden?
No reason.
As if to run away, Sol Ji-hoo left the giggling Yu Sonhwa behind and left.
Asterisk. The nighttime streets were chilly. Brr. Sol Ji-hoo hunched his shoulders and walked quickly. Several colors brushed past him. Green, green, blue, green, yellow, orange, yellow, yellow. Sol Ji-hoo, who was waiting for the traffic lights to change, suddenly narrowed his eyes. Red? He quickly scanned his surroundings. Soon, he saw a driver dozing off in a car parked halfway between the crosswalk. Sol Ji-hoo quickly walked up. Tang, tang. When he hit the windows hard, the driver jolted up. The window went down, and a strong smell of alcohol wafted out. You shouldn't be drinking and driving. The driver looked more than a little flustered.
He must have confused Sol Jihu for an off-duty officer. What should I do?
Sol Jihu pondered for a moment before taking out a bottle from his pocket. It was the bottle of pills he got from Sol Wusok before leaving his parents' house.
Take this.
It helps you sober up. When he opened the bottle and took out a pill, the driver took it and threw it into his mouth.
His unfocused eyes became clear in a second.
Ha! Park your car on the side of the road and get some fresh air. Call a chauffeur service if possible. Sol Jihu turned around only after confirming that the driver was parking his car and getting out. The traffic light changed, and Sol Jihu crossed the street. Just now, he had changed another future. Perhaps it would have been the future of dozens. That was how futures were. The same person might walk the same road and end up in a completely different place. One insignificant choice could be the factor in determining their destination. For example, Sol Jihu and Sol Jinhee had yet to make up with each other completely. But Sol Jihu no longer worried about the matter. It was because he could tell things were getting better over time. Golden Commandment. To treat others the way you want to be treated. As long as he acted properly with the thought of repenting, he believed he would eventually arrive at the future he desired. Black Sol Jihu said so as well. That he did not have a dream or the will to achieve it. That he was dragged around by fate without seeing what was in store for the future. That this was the reason he failed. Sol Jihu now understood what he meant. And now, Sol Jihu believed that all futures were open to those who had dreams and the will to achieve them. Sai apartment. It was a multi-use, high-rise complex that was said to be among Korea's most expensive apartments. Sol Jihu stood at the entrance and blew on his hands as he waited for the person he was supposed to meet. How much time went by? Suddenly, he felt a cold touch on the back of his hand. Looking down, he saw a tiny, white crystal. Snow? Staring in a daze, the crystal quickly liquefied and disappeared. Sol Jihu tilted his head up and looked at the sky. It started snowing. Sol Jihu heaved out a breath towards the falling snow. He could see his breath scattering like a puff of smoke. Excuse me. It was then. My apologies, but it is forbidden to smoke here. A calm yet warm voice spoke to him. There's a smoking area a little away from here. Sol Jihu slowly turned his head. If you'd like, you can come inside. She was standing there. A snow-like woman, wearing a white coat and a white scarf. Their eyes met. For a moment, they just stared at each other. This is... Sol Jihu quietly said. This is the first time we're meeting on Earth, right? Seo Yuhui smiled. No. She shook her head. It's the second time for me. Her eyes became a little dim as if she was recalling the past. After a short silence, Seo Yuhui grabbed Sol Jihu's hands. Her eyes glinting with an unknown expectation, she asked, "What's your name?" Name. Sol Jihu lowered his head a little and buried his mouth in his scarf. He didn't want her to see him laughing. For some reason, smiles refused to leave his face. The snow was flurrying down before he noticed. Sol Jihu stepped forward. So did Seo Yuhui. Inside the world of falling snow, Sol Jihu looked at Seo Yuhui, walking toward him step by step. My name is... Then, like the enormous snowflakes wishing the world happiness. Jihu. He smiled brightly and happily. Sol Jihu. Less than the end greater than.